Hubert quickly stood up to go get the money, eager to close the deal. Inside, Hubert fumed with frustration. He was a sixth circle mage, yet he had been outmaneuvered by a country bumpkin. He couldn't understand why these ridiculous problems kept arising during his time as Tower Master. He resolved that if Ghislain ever tried something like this again, he would burn the young man's head. Just as Hubert was about to leave, Ghislain called out, halting him with a final request. Ghislain revealed that he wasn't done yet, and had one more condition to present. Hubert, his patience now at an end, snapped at Ghislain, asking what more he wanted. Calmly, Ghislain stated that he wanted Vanessa handed over to him, leaving the room in stunned silence. Without anyone proficient in negotiation, no one stepped forward to lead the deal. Yet Ghislain's sudden demand to take Vanessa caught everyone off guard. The silence that followed hung heavily in the room. Breaking the tension, Hubert questioned whether Ghislain truly intended to take Vanessa. Ghislain confirmed this to the Tower Master, asserting that he would make Vanessa his personal mage. Fragments of a previous life flickered through Ghislain's mind. One where a sword used as a pan to grill meat for dinner. It had been during his time as the head of a mercenary group, taking a rare moment of rest between campaigns. By his side sat a subordinate, a sword brother, and to be precise was Ghislain's favorite slave named Claude, whose right hand had been replaced with a hook. As the meat sizzled, Ghislain noticed it was beginning to burn and made a sharp remark about it. In a tone laced with frustration, Claude challenged the complaint, pointing out the absurdity of making a one-armed man cook. Ghislain silently raised a clenched fist in response, prompting Claude to withdraw his words, pretending it had been a joke all along. Shifting the conversation, Claude brought up something that might interest his leader, a name spoken with intrigue, the Red Nightmare, Vanessa. Ghislain admitted ignorance, prompting Claude to elaborate. According to intel he recently gathered, the rumors spoke of a mage who had incinerated the northern region of Lithuania. She had reached the Seventh Circle, a woman known as Vanessa, feared and infamous as the Red Nightmare. Ghislain responded with mild curiosity, noting the title sounded extravagant, and asked for more details. Claude explained further. Allegedly, this mage had gone completely mad. Despite being a mage, she had taken the unusual route of learning mana cultivation. That oddity captured Ghislain's attention. He inquired why a mage would skip the mana circle method to pursue such a path. Claude offered a simple explanation: madness. He went on to describe Vanessa's rampage. Fires, deaths, and economic ruin followed wherever she went. The nobility had been driven to desperation. In fact, the most recent extermination request had her as the target. Ghislain paused to consider. A mage who had reached the Seventh Circle through mana cultivation, rather than traditional methods, intrigued him. As firelight danced in the camp and the crackle of burning would fill the silence, Ghislain smiled in amusement, evidently fascinated by the chaotic figure. It was then that he made a decision. Turning to Claude, he suggested they bring her in. Claude's reaction was one of pure disbelief. Reflecting on that moment, Ghislain knew that the plan had never come to fruition. Vanessa had already lost control of her magic, and by the time he found her, she was on the brink of death. Yet even then, her potential had not been extinguished. She still possessed the aptitude of a Seventh Circle mage. With guidance now, she could thrive under Perdium. Fueled by knowledge from a previous life, Ghislain had resolved to take her under his protection. At that moment, the trio began a comment. Ghislain asked if he was referring to the girl from earlier. Kaer chimed in, noting she hadn't appeared particularly powerful. Belinda leaned in closer, whispering a soft request to be informed beforehand if he ever intended to bring someone in. Meanwhile, across the room, murmurs spread among the mages. The Red Hat Elder whispered that the situation worked out perfectly. Vanessa had been a burden anyway, and giving her away seemed like an easy solution. The Yellow Hat Elder whispered that caring for her up to this point should be more than enough to honor their past ties with Lonato. With this in mind, Hubert approached and began to speak, formally acknowledging Vanessa as one of Scarlet Flame Tower's prized mages. He implied she would serve the tower well. Before he could finish, Ghislain cut him off with additional demands. Combat mages of the Third Circle or higher must also be dispatched to Perdium. Fury surged in Hubert's heart. He wondered whether Ghislain was planning some massive construction project on the estate. Ghislain clarified that mages were needed for territorial battles. The announcement sparked alarm among the elders. Combat mages typically earned hazard pay, and now the tower was being asked to supply them without compensation. Ghislain firmly reiterated his terms: triple the market price, deployment of third circle or higher mages to Perdium for a year, and Vanessa assigned as his personal mage. These three conditions were non-negotiable in exchange for the runestones. The trio tensed visibly. The demand for triple the market price alone was shocking, yet Ghislain had added more. On the other side, the elders glared at him with growing hostility. Hubert's mind raced. Purchasing the runestones at a high price might be justified given their urgent situation, but this felt like an overstep. Summoning his mana in a surge of rage, Hubert caused the room to tremble beneath the weight of his power. The elders joined in, unleashing their own magical presence to bear down on the young man. Yet Ghislain remained seated, unfazed, unaffected by the sheer force pressing in from all sides. Hubert locked eyes with him, voice brimming with indignation. The accusation rang clear. Ghislain Perdium must have believed him a fool. He invoked a long-standing law, declaring that mages affiliated with a magic tower were forbidden from participating in territorial warfare. To propose sending core mages of the third circle or higher into battle, while displaying ignorance of the kingdom's basic laws, was nothing short of an insult to the Scarlet Flame Tower. In Hubert's eyes, it warranted death, and he threatened to reduce Ghislain to ash. The reasoning, on paper, seemed sound. Ghislain had indeed made the first aggressive suggestion. The air grew tense as Belinda, Gillian, and Kayer prepared for confrontation. Their opponents were 5th and 6th circle mages, formidable foes. Even united, the odds remained unfavorable for them. Gillian braced himself to leap into action, prepared to shield his lord with his own body should the situation escalate. Yet, Ghislain remained composed. Calmly, he posed a question, one that gave Hubert pause. Was he truly certain he wouldn't regret this? Hubert hesitated, compelled to hear more. Ghislain then revealed a critical piece of information. A massive vein of runestones had been discovered within Perdium's territory, far exceeding the modest supply brought that day. In fact, by several dozen times. The revelation stunned Hubert and the elders. Their mana ebbed away as they listened. Ghislain continued, stating that news of the discovery was already spreading throughout the northern region. He posed a rhetorical question. What might that imply? Hubert understood instantly. Many would soon come seeking the runestone's vein. Ghislain commended the Tower Master's quick thinking. Rising to his feet, he clarified his intentions. Perdium had no desire to wage war. The territory simply needed the tower's support while building strength. If the Scarlet Flame Tower extended its help through this crisis, Ghislain promised an exclusive access to the runestones. Hubert echoed the offer. Exclusive rights? To seal the agreement, Ghislain extended a hand. With such a deal in place, it would only be a matter of time before the Scarlet Flame Tower surpassed the Crimson Magic Tower and reclaimed its position at the pinnacle. The proposal was tempting, enough to make pride take a back seat. Greed began to stir in Hubert's heart, overtaking the anger that had consumed him moments earlier. A reliable runestone supply represented a dream come true. Ghislain had struck a vulnerable nerve which offering both ambition and security. The storm of fury faded. With renewed optimism, Hubert grasped Ghislain's hand firmly, a smile curving his face. The shift in demeanor left Ghislain slightly unsettled. Following the meeting, Hubert pulled aside Alfoy. The decision was made that Alfoy would accompany the young lord to Perdium. Alfoy protested. He questioned the decision, pointing out the many other mages available. Hubert dismissed the objection. The greatest talent in Scarlet Flame Tower's history was being sent not out of obligation, but because the future depended on it. As chief officer, Alfoy would represent the tower's interests. The compliment left Alfoy glowing. Hearing those words from his master stirred pride. As the mercenaries began unloading the runestones, Hubert elaborated further. This mission would serve as preparation for his eventual ascension as Tower Master. He was to monitor the estate closely and prevent any attempts to divert the runestones. If a territorial conflict did erupt, he was to retreat without engaging. All that was required was endurance for 1 year. Within that time, The Scarlet Flame Tower would surpass Crimson and reclaim its place at the top. Alfoy accepted the mission eagerly, responding with unwavering resolve. However, the moment he arrived at Perdium, the excitement faded. His expression soured as he took in the estate's condition. Standing before the new arrivals, Ghislain welcomed the mages alongside his subordinates and mercenary forces. Among the mages, opinions were mixed. One observed that the castle was constructed in a classical style. Another added that while not flamboyant, it was practical. A third noted the use of proportional harmony in the architectural layout. But Alfoy seethed internally. In his eyes, it was nothing more than a wretched backwater. Only his master's command had brought him here. To think, the heir to the tower, reduced to working in such filth. When it came time to announce his position, Alfoy did so with formality. He identified himself as a third circle mage and heir to the Scarlet Flame Tower, assigned to lead the dispatched mages. However, Ghislain interrupted without hesitation. There was work to be done, and Alfoy was instructed not to let down his guard. The comment left Alfoy speechless. Rage churned inside him at being treated like a servant. Resentment brewed. Inwardly, he vowed that once he became Tower Master, he would deal with Ghislain accordingly. Ghislain called him back from his thoughts with a question. He wanted to know where Vanessa was. Alfoy turned casually, replying that she was likely at the back, handling the luggage. Soon after, Vanessa arrived, breath heavy as she carried the baggage in her arms. Gasping for breath, she finally made it to the gathering crowd. Through her fatigue, she opened her eyes and realized that the young lord himself stood there, welcoming them. Immediately, she bowed and offered her greeting. Alfoy muttered beneath his breath, urging her to hurry and remarking that he had doubted her arrival altogether. Ghislain briefly considered how to deal with the fool. Maiming the heir of the magic tower would certainly provoke backlash. It would be too risky. Instead, he approached the girl, raising a hand to beckon her forward. He instructed Vanessa to set everything down and come to him. Surprised, she responded hesitantly, reminding him that she had yet to finish moving everyone's luggage. Before she could continue, Ghislain grabbed one of the bags himself, even as Alfoy interjected dismissively. According to him, she had always done menial tasks at the tower, and, being incapable of using magic, might as well continue with chores. Before Alfoy could utter another word, Ghislain hurled the bag squarely at his face. Injuring the heir would have gone too far, but humiliation was just the right dose of punishment. Alfoy cried out in frustration, shouting in disbelief. Ghislain remained calm, asserting that Vanessa no longer belonged to the tower. From that moment on, she was under his protection, and mistreatment would not be tolerated. He then issued a warning that this incident would be overlooked, but if it ever happened again, the consequences would be severe. Watching the scene unfold, Vanessa slowly regained her breath. A faint blush bloomed across her cheeks as she witnessed someone stand up for her for the first time after a long while. But Alfoy refused to back down. His face twisted in rage as he shouted about the absurdity of being treated in such a way. He was the heir to the Scarlet Flame Tower, a third circle mage, and this backwater noble had dared to demean him. Rallying the others, he barked out a command. Even if their host bore a noble title, the insult had gone too far. The estate could be reduced to flames in an instant if they chose to act. He urged them to rise and defend their pride as mages. With a sigh, Ghislain snapped his fingers. At once, the mercenary army, hardened by the brutal conflict within the Forest of Beasts, moved to surround the mages with mechanical precision, responding immediately to their commander's gesture. Alfoy panicked. He shouted in disbelief, outraged that these savages would dare raise weapons against mages. This wasn't how mages were meant to be treated. Ghislain silenced him with a single command, cutting off the tirade. As the mages turned their attention to the young lord, he laid out the reality. No matter how they were treated, the terms of the contract were clear. He now held the legal right to command the mages for 1 year, granted directly by the master of the tower. In exchange, exclusive access to the runestones had been secured. If any of this fell apart due to their defiance, it would be the tower master, not them, who suffered the loss. Alfoy stood speechless, fully aware that losing access to the runestones would devastate the Scarlet Flame Tower. Ghislain pressed the point. Their only role in Perdium was to serve as backup mana sources. If they wanted better treatment, they should commit to that role without complaint. Alfoy's face burned with anger. The thought of being reduced to little more than a battery for others was beyond humiliating. Still, he could neither argue nor act. Turning away, Ghislain issued a command to Kair and Gillian that they were to ensure the mages learned their place. Lit up with unsettling glee, Kair commented that life at the tower must have been comfortable for the scholars. Gillian agreed, promising that the newcomers would adapt quickly to life in Perdium. Alfoy trembled with rage. He could barely contain his fury, but he remained powerless before the two. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood still, slightly flustered as she watched her former peers being disciplined before her eyes. She jumped slightly as Ghislain approached and addressed her. Ghislain asked that from that moment forward, she was to obey only him. He reiterated that she had become his personal mage. Her eyes widened in shock, and a soft blush colored her cheeks. Since the passing of her previous master, no one had ever treated her with such dignity. Yet doubt crept in. She looked away and expressed her concern. As Alfoy had pointed out, she couldn't even use magic. Being entrusted as a personal mage seemed far too much. Ghislain extended his hand in invitation. Being well aware of the potential hidden within her, Ghislain declared that he would make her capable of wielding magic, an offer to help her achieve her potential. Vanessa had originally resisted the idea of leaving the tower, remaining within its walls, even if it meant enduring the degrading treatment of a servant, would have allowed her to continue her magical studies. Following Perdium's young lord meant severing that connection. Yet, circumstances had left her no choice. Forced to accompany Ghislain, she had accepted his offer to assist with her magic, though her thoughts remained clouded by doubt. Curiosity stirred within her. Could a swordsman like him truly understand anything about the magic? Ghislain's sudden call pulled her from her musings. She responded without delay. He inquired, probing gently, about the extent of her magical education. With quiet hesitation, she confessed that she had reached the 5th circle, though her understanding remained limited to theoretical formulas. A kind smile crossed Ghislain's face as he silently formed his plan, which is to teach her the proper method of mana cultivation and oversee her progress personally. He commended her accomplishment, acknowledging that reaching the 5th circle was no trivial matter. Having spent her life as a mage constantly belittled and dismissed, Vanessa accepted the compliment half-heartedly, unable to read the young master's true intent. She lowered her gaze and admitted that, despite all her efforts, she still could not perform magic, rendering her studies seemingly meaningless. Although Ghislain already understood the cause of her inability, he asked anyway if there was a reason she couldn't use magic. Vanessa's reply came softly, her voice fraught with uncertainty. She revealed that she had never once sensed mana since childhood. Despite this, she had clung to hope, working relentlessly in pursuit of magic. But with each step forward in knowledge, her faith in her potential diminished. Her teacher, Juanato, who had once guided her, had since passed on. She wondered aloud if that was the reason she had ultimately been cast aside. Certain of her hidden potential, Ghislain resolved to begin by teaching her mana cultivation. If she could learn to apply what she already knew, her power could rival even the elders of the tower. In this state, with her knowledge of 5th circle magic intact, proper cultivation would elevate her to that level. She was exactly as he remembered from his past life, a brilliant mage, just as he had anticipated. In this era, memorization alone could not lead to mastery. The art of magic required comprehension of activation principles and a deep enough insight to shape spells through will and personal interpretation. Vanessa possessed the intellectual foundation, but her physical aptitude had yet to align. True control demanded enduring hardship, trial, and persistent experimentation. Ghislain believed her efforts had not been in vain. She had simply traveled a different, longer road. The voice of Claude echoed in memory, referencing a powerful mage from his former life, the woman who had raised northern Lithuania. She had reached the 7th circle, but her instability stemmed from blending magic and cultivation without proper technique. Despite her brilliance, her recklessness had made her infamous. That mistake, Ghislain intended to avoid. With full conviction, Ghislain announced that he would now teach Vanessa mana cultivation. Tension immediately overtook her. The idea of a mage learning such a technique made her uneasy. Her former master had introduced her to it once, but the attempt had failed. Her doubts surfaced immediately as she questioned why a mage should pursue such a path. Ghislain clarified that both magic circles and cultivation were grounded in the same force, which is mana. He then asked if she had ever practiced it properly. Her expression shifted to one of disbelief. Though she had studied the technique before, it had been under rigid instruction. The thought of being taught by a nobleman with no formal magical title seemed ludicrous. She shook her head firmly, rejecting the notion outright. To her, it was madness. Using mana cultivation to access magic seemed far too risky. The consequences of failure, internal damage, or permanent disability, were too severe to ignore. In that moment, Ghislain offered a reassuring smile. Extending his hand to her, he called her name and invited her to begin. Ghislain understood that the madness in Vanessa's past life had likely been the result of flawed technique colliding with long-standing resentment. He had seen similar signs before. Even knights occasionally succumbed to inner demons during intense training. But in this life, he believed things would unfold differently. Vanessa observed the sincerity in Ghislain's expression, silently beckoning her toward a path where she might finally become a true mage. She could not fully comprehend what he was offering. In a magic tower, she had been dismissed as a failure and a burden. Her gaze fell to the ground, attempting to mask the tremble in her eyes. She weighed the decision. Refusal might not even be an option. Ghislain could easily compel her, for what lay ahead otherwise was a descent into madness and eventual death. In the end, she gathered her courage and resolved to accept, if only for a chance to wield magic like a real mage. Anxious and uncertain, she positioned herself in front of Ghislain, seated with her back to him. With no hesitation, she loosened her collar and revealed her back, allowing him to begin the mana transfer. In his previous life, Ghislain had seen that same expression in her eyes, an endless hunger for magic mixed with regret, rage, and despair. She had sought power in desperation, turned to an unknown mana cultivation technique, and ultimately became a creature of destruction, ruled by instinct and pain. But now he stood before her in a different lifetime, meeting her before that spiral could begin. He made a silent vow to reach out before she fell into the abyss again. With that, he summoned his mana and placed a steady hand against her back. The process would be agonizing for her. If miscalculated, it could result in death. Nonetheless, he proceeded without hesitation. Mana surged from his hand and into her body, accompanied by a low hum. As the energy coursed through her, pain ripped through her nerves. A moan escaped her lips as the searing heat traveled through her mana pathways, eventually gathering just below her navel where Ghislain was guiding it. He sharply instructed her to remain silent, warning that the pathways were becoming tangled. He explained that the mana within her now belonged to him. She was told to focus on that foreign presence and not to lose track of it. She needed to feel it and follow its flow as best she could. Understanding the gravity of this moment, Vanessa closed her eyes and gave herself over to concentration. Every ounce of her attention was funneled into aligning herself with the mana inside her. Traditionally, she would be guided through the sensation first and only later create a mana core of her own. But that route carried no guarantee of success. Ghislain chose instead to prioritize sensation, helping her feel the full extent of mana flowing through her being. Her task now was to circulate the mana through her body's internal channels and condense it into a mana core. As Ghislain initiated the formation of a small, temporary core within her, Vanessa's eyes brightened. For the first time in her life, she truly felt mana, an experience she had once thought forever beyond her reach. Now, whether she could continue cultivation would depend entirely on her. The core, formed from Ghislain's mana, would eventually dissolve unless she built her own. Enraptured by the sensation, her mind drifted into the past. She remembered her origins as an orphan, Lanato, drawn by her intellect, had taken her in and lobbied for her future. Lanato had appealed to Hubert, claiming Vanessa's understanding of theory could uncover the fundamental regularity of mana particles and convert that knowledge into true spellcraft. Unconvinced, Hubert responded with a scoff. In his eyes, no amount of intelligence mattered if she could not cast even the simplest spell. He posed the question coldly. If a child could not use magic, could she be called a mage? From behind a cracked door, the young Vanessa had listened in silence as her teacher pleaded on her behalf. Hubert had delivered his verdict with finality. No matter how many resources were poured into her, he declared, nothing worthwhile would ever come out. Vanessa saw her younger self, struggling beneath a kind teacher's care, still unable to feel mana or form even a single magic circle. There had been a time when Vanessa wept openly, offering apologies to her master. Tears streamed down her face as she blamed herself, believing that if only she had possessed more talent, her master would never have been forced to leave the magic tower. Yet Lanato had left, driven by a single purpose, to search for a method that would allow Vanessa to wield magic. Before the departure, Lanato left her with parting words, urging her to lift her head and look toward the sky. Lanato spoke of a world where darkness did not last forever and promised that one day, even she would witness the arrival of light. And now, that light had come in the form of Ghislain, who extended his hand to her so she could finally glimpse the mana and magic she had long yearned for since first setting foot in a magic tower. Within her inner world, Vanessa realized that her master's words had been true. Even someone like her was not beyond a reach of light. Elsewhere, a warrior clashed with a group of soldiers. Chaos erupted as one of the soldiers cried out in alarm, exclaiming that the man had already taken down 4 of them and questioning what kind of monster he could possibly be. With taunting bravado, the wild warrior challenged them, daring the rest to come forward. He scoffed at their swords, mocking them as mere metal toys. Provoked, one of the soldiers lunged, blade poised for a precise thrust. The warrior dodged easily with a sidestep and seized the attacker in a firm grip. Using his full strength and the momentum of his body, he slammed the soldier hard onto the floor. Another assailant rushed in from behind, attempting to attack while the warrior was preoccupied. But the warrior noticed in time and, without missing a beat, swung the first soldier like a rag doll, striking the newcomer with brutal efficiency. Both were hurled through the wall of their barracks with a crash. The warrior stood over them, unbothered, and remarked that he had not even begun to warm up. Inside the barack, Victor drank alone in silence, untouched by the uproar. One observing soldier murmured in awe, declaring the man is the greatest warriors of the era. With his meal finished, Victor set down his cup. Seeking quiet in the restless life of a night, he stretched out beside a riverbank, a fishing rod planted lazily nearby. Another man approached and asked if his training had gone well. Victor, unmoved, simply asked what news he brought. The man reported a dispatch order from Count Desmond. Victor rested in silence for a moment. As the Count soared, refusal was never an option. For the sake of honor, he retrieved his helmet and donned it once more. Returning to the barracks, he found his men bloodied from the brawl, but spared them no attention. Boredom had long eaten away at him. Now, at last, there was a mission. He intended to raise the target Count Desmond had set before him. Count Dygald had abruptly declared war on Perdium. The proclamation, delivered by a messenger, reached Zwalter as Randolph stood beside his brother in his office. Zwalter read through the declaration several times, his face darkening. The document laid out an elaborate list of reasons why the war was supposedly justified, asserting that Count Dygald had ample cause for such a drastic action. At its core, however, it simply stated that Dygald's heir, Gilmore Dygald, had been killed by Ghislain Perdium, and now vengeance was sought in the declaration. Without delay, Zwalter ordered Randolph to summon the vassals to discuss the declaration of war. As the vassals gathered, Randolph expressed his disbelief at the absurd justification, remarking that the Dygalds must have lost their minds. There was no way the young lord had killed Gilmore. The vassals quickly voiced their own outrage. Furious, one of them stated that starting a war based on false pretenses was intolerable, and they needed to be put in their place. Another lamented the long-standing alliance within the northern regions, questioning how anyone could have expected Dygald to turn its back on them. A third raised a question of what Dygald hoped to achieve by fighting them, while the vassals continued to seethe with anger. Denouncing Count Dygald at every turn, Zwalter stood deep in thought. Known throughout the kingdom as a benevolent lord who had never enslaved his people, Zwalter had always faithfully carried out his duties, serving as the northernmost defender against the barbarian raids that constantly threatened the northern villages. Suddenly, Zwalter's attention snapped back to the room when Ghislain spoke to his father, mentioning the runestones. Ghislain reminded them that 2 of their retainers had been sent to Dygald as envoys while Ghislain had been at the magic tower. He suspected that these envoys might have leaked critical information about their territory. Once more, chaos erupted as one vassal questioned Ghislain's accusations, demanding to know what evidence he had to make such a dangerous claim. However, Ghislain remained unfazed, while Zwalter fell silent, reflecting deeply on his son's words. The runestones, he realized, might have been the catalyst. Sometimes, actions intended to benefit a territory ended up becoming its undoing. Zwalter looked at his son, now seeing the calm demeanor of someone who seemed to have known the war was coming. Despite his youth, Ghislain, who had once been known as the Mercenary King in his past life, remained composed. On the other hand, Randolph grew more impatient, stating that there was no need to overthink the situation. Their forces outnumbered Dygald's, and they had far more battle experience. They should make them pay for picking a fight. At that moment, a knight burst into the room. It was Scoven, bearing bad news from the gate. Breathing heavily, Scoven reported that Dygald's forces had arrived. Before the vassals could even process the news, the devastating blow to their morale was already clear. A high-level knight, on the cusp of becoming a superhuman-level master, was leading the charge. Dressed in shining silver armor, Victor, the Count Desmond's sword, had been trained from a young age and now carried the flag of Dygald to raise Perdium to the ground. Though Dygald was not a prosperous territory, much like all the estates in the harsh northern region, the exception was Desmond and Raymond's territories. Count Desmond, while feigning neutrality, had already aligned himself with the duchy's factions, and Amelia was stirring rebellion in Raymond with the support of the duchy. Now, the duchy's power was bearing down on the impoverished territory of Perdium under the pretext of a senseless justification. As all of this unfolded, Randolph seethed in fury, asking aloud how it was possible that they had declared war and arrived so quickly. Albert added, wondering when they had even prepared all of this. Meanwhile, as a seasoned commander, Zwalter remained deep in thought. Moments later, Soldier reported that a confirmed force of about 6,000 armed soldiers, with a follow-up supply division of approximately 1,000. Numerous siege weapons had also been spotted, and deployment had already begun on Dygald's forces. The revelation left Homern in a panic. He turned to Randolph, his voice filled with alarm, as he questioned what was happening. The power gap seemed insurmountable. Equally stunned, Albert voiced his confusion. He pointed out that Dygald was just as poor as Perdium. So how could they have raised such a massive army? Still grappling with the situation, Randolph responded with frustration, reiterating that this was exactly why he had warned them before not to reduce their forces. Fed up with the constant bickering, Zwalter screamed at the vassals to get a grip. He told them that arguing would only delay their response, and ordered that all soldiers be gathered at the walls. He commanded that every citizen be brought into the castle, and every gate should be shut tight. The soldiers were to hold their positions. With his gaze hardened by years of harsh northern battles, Zwalter stated firmly that the war had begun. At the forefront of the Dygald army, Tomos Dygald hummed to himself as he gazed at the towering Perdium fortress. Confident that Count Desmond's support would ensure victory, he was certain the fortress would soon fall into his hands. Tomos grinned as he thought of Gilmore, his son. While Gilmore had been a lazy and useless heir, his death had given Thamos a valid reason to strike Perdium. Gilmore's death didn't trouble him much, because he could always have another son. But the chance to seize Perdium with overwhelming support was something that could only come once. Turning to Victor, Thamos asked that he accompany him, as he had something to discuss with Count Perdium. When they arrived before the wall, Zwalter shouted out in defiance, demanding to know what kind of atrocity Thamos was committing. Thamos laughed to himself, responding that what he was doing wasn't an atrocity. His beloved son, Gilmore Dygald, had been killed on this land, and he was now here for revenge. With a menacing grin, he added that Zwalter's son, Ghislain Perdium, had killed his son. What parent wouldn't be enraged by the death of their child? Thamos then offered Zwalter a chance to end the conflict without further bloodshed, suggesting that if he surrendered now, it could all stop. Ghislain, who knew that Count Desmond was backing Dygald in this war, stood silently, observing the unfolding events. Filled with rage, Randolph shouted at Thamos, denouncing his lies. Equally disgusted, Homer agreed with Randolph, stating that any further conversation would be meaningless. However, Ghislain was lost in thought. While saving Elena had bought him time, he knew that with Gilmore's death, this war was inevitable. The fact that Dygald had brought siege weapons confirmed his worst fears that they were intent on crushing Perdium completely. At that moment, Zwalter stepped forward, declaring that Ghislain had not killed Gilmore. With a gaze hardened by years of defending the northern fortress against barbarian raids, Zwalter stated firmly that this was his only answer. He warned Thamos that if he valued his life, he should leave now. Thamos was visibly startled by the intensity of Zwalter's gaze, but Victor remained silent, standing unwaveringly by his side. Victor observed Zwalter, thinking to himself that the Northern Wolf had truly earned his reputation. Zwalter Perdium embodied the spirit of a great general who had defended the North for so long. Sweating heavily, Thamos acknowledged Zwalter's reputation, stating that as expected of the Northern Wolf, Zwalter's choice was a foolish one. He warned Zwalter not to regret his decision and turned back to his forces with a final threat. Meanwhile, Zwalter knew that this would be a difficult battle. Perdium was a poor territory with barren land and few provisions, ill-prepared to withstand a prolonged siege. Feeling the weight of the situation, Randolph pleaded with Zwalter, asking him to entrust all the troops to him. He was confident that, as a high-level knight, he could easily defeat the poorly trained rabble Dygald had assembled. Albert interjected, warning Randolph that no matter how strong he was, the sheer gap in numbers was simply too great to overcome. Homer shared the same sentiment, stating that with only one loss, Perdium would be finished. However, Randolph could not remain silent and retorted that they couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Zwalter stood silently, his mind racing. The vassals began suggesting that they request aid from other territories and hold out until reinforcements arrived. As a last resort, they could abandon the castle and retreat to the northern fortress. Amidst the chaotic arguments between the vassals, Zwalter struggled to think clearly. A sudden declaration of war, with the enemy already fully prepared, was overwhelming. The sheer number of Dygald's forces was unimaginable. There was no way they should have been able to muster such a large army. Zwalter couldn't help but wonder who had supported them. As a lord, he knew he couldn't flee the castle, but as a father, he was certain that Ghislain had not killed Gilmore, and thus he could not surrender. Just then, his thoughts were interrupted when Ghislain suggested they prepare for a siege. Zwalter turned to face his son. He hadn't noticed it before, but Ghislain's composure stood in stark contrast to the panic around them. Ghislain continued, explaining that Dygald's forces numbered nearly 7,000, while Perdium could barely gather just over 2,000. The gap was more than 3-1. Dygald's forces were fully prepared, and their morale was high. Within 15 days, once their siege weapons were ready, they would launch their full assault. The calmness in Ghislain's voice prompted Zwalter to listen more closely. Ghislain added that, for now, requesting help and holding the castle was their best option. Still feeling the weight of the situation, Zwalter agreed. Normally, this would be the course of action he would take, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Just then, a slight arc formed on Ghislain's lips. He moved closer to his father and whispered something into his ear. When Ghislain finished, Zwalter was visibly surprised. The content of those words remained between them, excluded from the vassals of Perdium. The countdown to the inevitable clash between Dygald's forces, supported by Desmond's territory, and Perdium had begun. In 15 days, Ghislain had decided to put everything he had into turning the tables. Knowing Perdium could not stand on its own, he planned to play the game differently. Donning his dark-tinted armor, Ghislain gathered his future aides, Ghislain, Kaer, and Belinda. Ghislain, who would later be known as the White Lion of Fenris, was a former mercenary who, though not yet a knight, was on par with a middle-level knight. He was the first person to swear loyalty to Ghislain. Kaer, the redhead, would become known throughout the Shadow Mountain as the King of Leather. He was an unruly mercenary who had fallen into obedience after Ghislain's rigorous training. Then there was Belinda, a mysterious figure whom Ghislain's mother had brought into Perdium. She hailed from a shadowy assassin organization and had been entrusted with the care of Ghislain and Elena after their mother's death. With them gathered, the war had truly begun. In his past life as the Mercenary King, Ghislain had been one of the 7 strongest on the continent. Though his individual strength wasn't ranked among the highest, his tactical brilliance in battle had earned him a place among the top 3. If time had allowed, Ghislain would have sought out one of the legendary figures he knew from his past life, Claude, Ghislain's #1 slave. Claude had flipped kingdoms upside down alongside the Mercenary King. But time was not on his side, and there was no opportunity to fetch him. With the resources he had at hand, and with the knowledge of a man who had rewound time, Ghislain began to elaborate his plan. He explained to his aides what needed to be done. Before Dygald's forces advanced, they would strike at their supply unit. If they cut off the supplies, continuing the war would become incredibly difficult for Dygald. Cautiously, Belinda posed a question, wondering how they could achieve such a feat because the area in front of the castle was already occupied by Dygald's troops, and there were too many eyes watching. Any attempt to act would be noticed immediately. Ghislain turned to Kaer and Ghislain, asking if their preparations were complete. Kaer reported that, as ordered, they had stationed troops in advance at the forest of Beast Outpost. If needed, the troops could hide in the forest, ensuring they wouldn't be discovered. Next, Ghislain reported that the ponchos, made from Dyrus Int bark as Ghislain had requested, had been distributed to the soldiers. The dark material was perfect for night operations, making it easier for the soldiers to blend into the shadows. Pointing at the map, Ghislain explained that a large force would naturally be easily spotted, but a small, elite unit wearing camouflage wouldn't be as easy to detect, making an ambush a viable strategy. However, Belinda couldn't shake her concern for her young lord. Despite his calm demeanor, she couldn't help but worry about the risks he was taking. Ghislain turned to her, explaining that the one problem they still faced was not knowing where Dygald's supply unit was located. He ordered Belinda to find the location of Dygald's supply unit. Startled by the gravity of the mission, Belinda paused, thinking carefully. She knew she had to protect the young lord, but she also wondered how Ghislain could be so daring in devising such a risky plan. After a moment of hesitation, Belinda replied with a firm understanding that she would carry out the task. On the other hand, Ghislain thought to himself that this was a dangerous mission, sneaking into enemy lines, risking death, but he trusted Belinda. He knew she would handle it with ease. Now, there was only one thing left for him to do: play his ultimate trump card to end the war. In his past life, Ghislain had known Vanessa as the Red Nightmare, a figure who had gained legendary status after raising the Lithania kingdom following her breakthrough to 7th Circle Mage status. Her talent and unconventional mana cultivation technique had turned her into a force to be reckoned with. In this war, Vanessa had become an indispensable force for Perdium. A few days later, at Dygald's supply unit camp, the darkness shrouded the area, with the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Unaware of the impending devastation, Baron Fabreau, a vassal of Dygald and the commander of the supply unit, cheerfully proclaimed that the war had finally begun. He eagerly anticipated the day he would be granted his own land. Perdium's former retainers, who had joined his camp, agreed, with one stating that joining Desmond's side had been the right decision. The support from their troops had earned him a cushy rear position. Another retainer raised his glass, praising the other's excellent decision-making. Drinking heartily, Fabreau continued to revel in the moment. He waved his glass, shouting that Perdium would soon be nothing but a distant memory, and part of the land would soon be his. In the darkness surrounding the camp, Ghislain's force lay in wait. Leading the charge, Ghislain had gathered his entire mercenary army. His plan was simple: wipe out the Dygald supply unit and cut off their resources, crippling the Dygald main force stationed in front of Perdium Castle. Despite the gravity of the war to come, Ghislain's future aides jested among themselves. Belinda sighed, commenting that the weather was particularly gloomy. Noticing the same, Kair remarked that it was hard to see anything in the pitch-black darkness. Reaching for his helmet visor, Ghislain smirked, noting that it was perfect weather for a surprise attack. Everything was ready, so Ghislain pulled his visor down and reached for his sword. With determination in his eyes, he commanded his forces to take no prisoners and to kill them all. Leading the charge with unrestrained fury, Ghislain's eyes showed no mercy. The hatred he carried for Desmond County and the duchy drove him to bulldoze anything and anyone who dared to threaten what was his. Disguised as Dygald recruits and mercenaries, the sheer size of the force made it unmistakable that it was Outside Lord, helping in the war dispute between Perdium and Dygald. Shrouded in the darkness of the night sky, no one in the camp realized an ambush was closing in until the opposing force was at their doorstep and Ghislain's force emerged from the shadows. With a savage grin, Kair tore through the battlefield. With each swing of his sword, he struck down a soldier stationed at the supply unit of Dygald's force. To the left, Ghislain wielded a long-handled battle axe. Every swing felled a few soldiers in his path, cleaving through their ranks without hesitation. His axe, cutting through the chaos of battle, sent soldiers flying in all directions. Mana surged through Ghislain's body, propelling him to sever the necks of every soldier in his path. His blade, empowered by the mana, cut through the soldiers effortlessly. He pushed through the fear, the uncertainty, and charged forward with all his might. Nearby, Belinda charged ready to cover his back. Though worried about her young lord's first battle against human opponents, she did not voice her concerns, staying vigilant as she prepared to protect him from any potential threats. The Dygald soldiers were in disarray. Unprepared for an ambush, they had underestimated the tactical capabilities of Perdium's forces. They thought that dividing their troops would be impossible, never considering such a well-coordinated attack. However, Ghislain and Ghislain made quick work of them. They were no ordinary warriors. Ghislain, drawing from the experience of his past life, led his mercenaries with the precision of a high-level knight, and Gillian's battle-hardened skills only added to the might of the force. The soldiers on the outskirts were wiped out in an instant. Ghislain quickly reached the opposite end of the camp, spun his horse around, and issued orders to move according to plan. He instructed that not a single soldier of Dygald's would survive the night. Torches, struck by flying bodies, were scattered about, igniting nearby tents. Soon, flames began to spread across the camp. Chaos erupted as soldiers ran about in confusion. One of the high-ranking officials in Dygald's unit rushed toward his superior. The soldier breathlessly informed Baron Fabreau that they had been ambushed, urging him to take immediate action. Fabreau swiftly exited his tent, frustration boiling over as he took in the sight of his camp in chaos. He bellowed at the soldiers nearby, demanding to know where the guards had been. Panic surged in his mind, and Fabreau shouted orders for his forces to regroup. He insisted that they still outnumbered the enemy, urging them to form ranks and stop the attack. Despite his efforts to calm himself, the reality of the situation was beginning to set in. The soldier returned with grim news that over 70% of their forces had already been wiped out. The man, the myth, the legend, Gordon the Muscle followed closely behind Ghislain. Hardened from battles in the Forest of Beasts, the mercenaries' charge was unstoppable. His immense strength and brutal efficiency tore through the enemy soldiers with terrifying speed. Ghislain, noticing the need to conserve stamina, switched to a smaller weapon, sacrificing some of his destructive power but enabling him to move faster and continue his assault. Meanwhile, Kair remained fierce, striking soldiers with precision, cutting through their ranks with reckless abandon. Ghislain stayed resolute, his eyes gleaming with killing intent. His blade, sharpened with mana, sliced through the soldiers with practiced ease, each strike landing with deadly accuracy. Though his strength was a fraction of what he had in his previous life, Ghislain was, in this skirmish, the harbinger of death. His mercenaries followed his every move. Noticing Ghislain charging at the front lines, Fabreau recognized him as an entirely different presence. His face drenched in sweat, Fabreau finally realized that his 1,000 soldiers had no chance against such a force. In a panic, Fabreau turned abruptly, ordering a retreat. His aide looked confused, but Fabreau was certain that if the battle continued, he would lose his head, not just his land. In that instant, his aide was struck in the neck with uncanny precision. Shock flashed across Fabreau's face as he watched in silent attack. The speed and accuracy of the attack left him paralyzed with fear. Though Fabreau himself was unharmed, he collapsed to the ground, following the sound of his aide's lifeless body hitting the earth. It was Belinda who had reached them. Sitting atop her horse, she coldly addressed him, her voice carrying a chilling calmness. She remarked on the unlikely meeting, calling him the vassal of Perdium. Fear surged through Fabreau's mind. His 1,000 soldiers had been obliterated, and he had relied too heavily on their sheer numbers, missing his opportunity to escape. His camp was burning, and the corpses of soldiers and knights lay scattered across the battlefield. In an effort to wage war against Perdium, Dygald's entire supply unit had been wiped out, leaving only Fabreau alive. Now, with his hands bound behind his back, Fabreau knelt in front of Ghislain and his mercenary army. Though he bore a noble title, Fabreau had no choice but to surrender. It was common in wartime for nobles to be taken as prisoners rather than executed. Just then, Belinda stepped on him, her boot pressing Fabreau's head into the dirt. Belinda informed the others that Fabreau was one of the vassals sent as an envoy to Dygald. Not only had he been selling information, but he had also been acting as Dygald's supply commander. Panic gripped Fabreau as he pleaded with Ghislain, desperately begging for mercy. He surrendered without hesitation, throwing himself at Ghislain's mercy, hoping to survive. He had never imagined that the young Lord of Perdium, despite his reputation as the northern scoundrel, could lead such a force in battle. However, Ghislain remained calm and asked to bribe Fabreau, seizing what he believed to be a fleeting opportunity for survival. Fabreau quickly revealed that he had been bribed by Count Desmond. He also explained that he had been threatened and had no choice but to follow through with his actions. Ghislain didn't linger on the information. His mind quickly shifted to the demons from his past life. With Fabreau's admission, Ghislain knew for certain that Desmond's county had provided troops to Dygald to wage war against Perdium. Feeling ignored, Fabreau became more desperate. He wailed loudly, insisting that, despite his actions, he had served Perdium for a long time. He argued that Count Dygald would surely pay a hefty ransom for his release, claiming that sparing him would be a profitable deal for Ghislain. Ghislain dismounted from his horse, his eyes unwavering, and told Fabreau to raise his head. The words caused a brief flicker of relief to wash over the captured noble. Fabreau thought he was being granted mercy. In his relief, Fabreau began to make grand promises. He thanked Ghislain for sparing his life and vowed that with the life he had been given, he would serve Perdium with everything he had. But before Fabreau could finish his words, Ghislain swung his sword, severing his neck in a single, smooth motion. The strike was immediate and without hesitation. Ghislain had no recollection of Fabreau from his past life's timeline, suggesting that Fabreau had never been significant. In that fleeting moment, Fabreau was left unable to understand why he had been executed. Ghislain sighed, finding the situation absurd. He stated that he would never show noble courtesy on the battlefield, and that he would never make a deal with someone like Fabreau, whom he considered scum. With vengeance burning in his eyes, Ghislain vowed to hunt down every person who had turned their sword toward Perdium. He promised that death would come for them all. Once the deed was done, Ghislain led his mercenary army away from the remains of Dygald's supply camp. Despite the skirmish with 1,000 soldiers, Ghislain's forces had suffered little more than exhaustion, with no significant losses. Still concerned, Belinda watched Ghislain closely. This had been his first battle, and she couldn't help but wonder how he had killed so many soldiers with such apparent ease. He made it seem as natural as breathing, and yet the act of killing humans, as opposed to monsters, should have been far more difficult to bear. Kair approached Ghislain and asked what their next course of action would be. Ghislain, with his usual focus, replied that they would head straight back to the castle. He suspected that the enemy would likely attack immediately. With siege weapons at their disposal, Dygald's forces had been hurling massive stones at Perdium's castle walls. This was possible only because Count Desmond's county had provided them with the means to attack. As the catapults rained stones upon the walls, Dygald's infantry charged forward, attempting to overwhelm Perdium's smaller forces. Being a tactical strategist, Ghislain issued orders swiftly for Kair and Belinda to provide support on the left wall once they arrived, while he himself would move to the right wall. Right after, Ghislain called out to Ghislain, putting him in charge of attacking Dygald's base. He explained that the assault was a surprise attack, and that he expected Ghislain to face off against thousands of soldiers with a much smaller force. With that, Ghislain turned to Ghislain and asked if he could handle the task. A faint smile crossed Ghislain's lips as his eyes gleamed with excitement. He answered affirmatively, assuring his young lord that it would be no problem and that he would follow his orders without hesitation. In response, Ghislain smiled, the thought of his loyal mercenary pleasing him. After all, Ghislain was like a sleeping lion, waiting to be awakened when the time was right. On the other hand, Kair scoffed, expressing his dissatisfaction that the old man always seemed to get the more exciting tasks. Meanwhile, Belinda raised a more pressing concern about who would defend the gate. Ghislain gave a definitive answer, ordering them to leave the gate alone. With the strategic mind of a seasoned commander, Ghislain did not explain further. With his experience as the Mercenary King, who had once razed an entire kingdom to the ground, Will always had a plan. This left Ghislain's aides slightly confused. After all, to them, Ghislain was still a young lord who had gained fame as the northern scoundrel and was commanding an army for the first time. They had expected him to be uncertain, but his calm demeanor and strategic orders led them to wonder what he had in mind. Ghislain did not provide further explanation. Instead, he simply stated that this war would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Perdium's history. Meanwhile, Zwalter, a valiant high-level knight, stood firm against the overwhelming number of enemies. His voice rang out clearly, ordering his soldiers to prepare for the incoming assault. On the opposite side of the wall, Randolph, also a high-level knight, commanded the archers to fire at the advancing enemy. Though their numbers had been reduced by the rain of arrows, Dygald's soldiers were still too numerous to be easily stopped. With ladders in hand, they began scaling the walls, their numbers overwhelming Perdium's defenses. As the Dygald forces swarmed the wall, Zwalter immediately ordered his soldiers to engage in close-quarter combat. His brother Randolph closely followed behind. With the two of them leading the charge, they hoped to hold off the advancing enemy. Seeing the wall begin to crumble and his forces overwhelm it, the commander of Dygald's forces laughed manically. His joy was palpable as he thought victory was finally within his reach. He clapped his hands in delight, exclaiming how exhilarating it was. Even without dispatching their strongest knight, he was sure the battle was won. However, Victor remained focused, keeping his eyes on the battlefield. As Dygald continued issuing orders for the catapults to prepare for a second volley, Victor thought inwardly that it was finally time for the Northern Wolf to meet his end. He had hoped to face Zwalter, but now, seeing the way things were unfolding, he believed he wouldn't even need to lift a finger. Inside the walls, Zwalter, the Northern Wolf, faced a relentless swarm of mercenaries disguised as Dygald soldiers. With practiced ease, he blocked an incoming attack, sidestepping and swinging his sword to strike at the side of one of the mercenaries. But the enemy continued to pour in, and despite his strength and skill, Zwalter, alongside Randolph, found themselves surrounded. Maintaining his composure, Randolph expressed his frustration. The walls were one thing, but at this rate, the gate would fall soon. Thus, he asked what the Lord's orders were. Deciding to trust in Ghislain's earlier instructions, Zwalter ordered the soldiers to focus solely on holding the walls and to leave the gate alone. After giving the order, Zwalter turned to Scovin, asking about reinforcements. Scovin reported that the messengers sent to the surrounding territories had all returned with refusal of support. The Zimbar and Rayfold territories both claimed internal issues and could not provide assistance. Furthermore, every messenger sent to Count Loges had lost contact, and no word had come back. For various reasons, not a single estate had offered any support. Frustrated, Randolph could only curse under his breath, wondering aloud how none of the territories had sent help. He could barely contain his anger at their unwillingness to support Perdium, calling them ungrateful bastards. Within the ranks of Dygald's forces, bad news also reached the command post, delivered by a soldier. Both Dygald and Victor were visibly surprised when a soldier reported the possibility that their supply unit had been ambushed. The soldier explained that the soldiers they had sent to request supplies still hadn't returned, which suggested something had gone wrong with the supply unit. However, Dygald refused to accept such a possibility. He could not fathom that their supply unit, consisting of 1,000 soldiers, could have been wiped out while Perdium's entire force was holed up in their castle. On the other hand, Victor considered the report carefully. He suspected the possibility might be true. Though the supply unit's location was supposed to be covert, Victor could already see smoke billowing up from the area. Inwardly, Victor thought to himself that there was still someone in Perdium bold enough to think strategically. It was common knowledge that the smaller an army's strength, the harder it was to risk such a bold strategy. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he realized how interesting the war was becoming. At this point, Dygald turned to Victor and asked what they should do. Without supplies, their siege would be cut short, especially considering that Perdium's entire army was holding up within their castle. Victor raised his hand, silencing Dygald's concerns. If they couldn't thin out Perdium's supplies, they would simply break through Perdium's walls with their sheer numbers. He was confident they did not need supplies, stating with certainty that they would take Perdium's castle by the end of the day. Dygald stammered in disbelief. If they charged relentlessly, they would undoubtedly overwhelm Perdium's forces, but the losses they would suffer would be catastrophic. At that moment, Victor considered killing Dygald right there and then. After all, Dygald was merely Desmond's pawn, while Victor, the real commander, striving to be known as the Northern finest sword. But for now, Victor chose to spare him, deciding to deal with him later when Perdium had fallen. Victor continued his assessment of the battle. The assault on the left and right walls had begun long ago, yet they hadn't broken through. He thought of how Perdium's elite forces, including the Northern Wolf, were likely holding the line. But as he surveyed the situation, he noticed that the front gate was left undefended. It seemed clear to him that the gate lacked any defenders. With that realization, he raised his sword and ordered the rest of his army to charge forward. His voice was filled with conviction as he proclaimed that, by the end of the day, they would smash through the gate. Behind him, Desmond's forces, disguised as Dygald soldiers, advanced with their siege towers. Their sheer number dwarfed anything that Perdium could muster. Victor observed the ranks of his forces charging toward Perdium's castle, the overwhelming numbers striking with brutal force. Though striving as the finest sword of the northern region, Victor still longed to achieve greater things as a commander of an army. He hoped that through these accomplishments, he could elevate his status and perhaps even earn a noble title, something to solidify his place among the greats. With this ambition in mind, he called upon one of his subordinates, Adon, before riding into battle himself. A loud thud resounded as Adon, riding his horse, drew nearer. Adon was the kind of man who took pleasure in fighting for sport, beating people for amusement to stave off boredom. But when it came to war, he was completely obedient and followed orders without hesitation. He wielded a massive, long-handled sword, a weapon so heavy that it was a clear indication of his immense physical strength. He approached Victor with military discipline, his usual chaotic demeanor vanishing entirely before his commanding officer. Victor outlined his plan to Adon. He would charge toward the castle gate himself, ordering Adon to stay at the rear and hold the formation. Though he knew that one man was enough for the task, Victor chose to err on the side of caution, knowing the Perdium army was barricaded within their castle. With Adon at the rear, Victor led the charge, his cavalry and siege weapons following closely behind, though the sheer number of the siege weapons might have seemed excessive for this siege war. Meanwhile, Dygald's infantry scaled the castle walls with ladders. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they faced great difficulty in overtaking the defenders and opening the gate. Yet their morale remained unshaken, and they pressed on, climbing despite the certain death that awaited them at the top. Zwalter and Randolph held the line at the wall, standing firm against the onslaught. As knights nearing the upper levels of their order, they were a force to be reckoned with. With each swing of their swords, an enemy soldier fell. Though they could hold the line against the swarm of enemies with their strength, it was evident that Dygald's forces would eventually overwhelm the castle. In a moment of rising tension, Scovin, an experienced knight of Perdium, suddenly called out to his lord, panic evident in his voice. Zwalter quickly turned his head to see what had unsettled the knight. The sight that greeted him nearly made his blood run cold. The enemy had brought forward siege towers, enough to completely take over the walls. The towering structures, coupled with ladders, suggested that they had been carefully prepared long before Count Dygald's son had met his death. Zwalter cursed under his breath, his thoughts racing. He wondered aloud how the enemy had managed to calculate the height of the walls with such precision. Struggling to maintain control, Randolph pointed out that they were already overwhelmed by the sheer number of infantry climbing the walls. With the arrival of the siege towers, he had little confidence that the castle would hold on. Zwalter turned back to his soldiers, his expression grim, and asked if the catapults were ready. A soldier quickly reported that one catapult had just been set up. Though constructed hastily, there was hope that the catapults could at least reduce the number of enemies charging to the walls. Within moments, the crew adjusted the catapult's aim and fired a stone toward one of the enemy's siege towers. One soldier from Dygald cursed at the sight, calling Perdium dogs, and wondered aloud when the enemy had found time to build catapults to counter their towers. The trajectory of the stone was unmistakable. It would hit the tower and destroy it. However, Victor, now nearing the front line, was not about to let that happen. He grabbed a spear, infused it with his mana, and hurled it at the incoming stone. The collision was deafening, and the stone shattered into dust, pulverized by the magical energy of the spear. The sight sent shockwaves through Dygald's forces, bolstering their morale. On the side of Perdium, however, disbelief set in. The idea that a projectile had been intercepted midair made it clear that a high-level knight was among Dygald's ranks, something they had not expected. Among the high-level knights known throughout the northern region, Zwalter realized that Dygald had no such individual among his ranks. It was only now that he fully understood the scale of the war. This was a conflict orchestrated by one of the great lords of the north. As Victor led his cavalry forward, he boldly declared that no resistance from Perdium would change the outcome of the battle. No matter how fiercely they fought, Victor was certain that he would bring Perdium to its knees. Without hesitation, he commanded the battle ram to charge toward the castle gate. The battle ram surged forward, unstoppable in its momentum. Dygald's forces were overwhelmingly superior, their siege weapons carefully crafted for this very assault. The presence of a high-level knight within their ranks only further amplified the disparity in strength between the two sides. As the siege tower docked against the castle walls, heavy infantry emerged and swarmed over the defenders. The hope that Perdium might still hold out was rapidly fading. It seemed as though their downfall was now inevitable. The battle ram continued to pound against the gate, with no forces from Perdium positioned to intercept it. If left unchecked, the once impenetrable northern wall, Perdium would soon crumble. Lost in thought, Zwalter wondered about his son, questioning whether his plan had succeeded. Given the current state of the war, he feared that Perdium would fall. He also doubted that the mercenary forces led by Ghislain could make a significant difference at this point. Outside the gate, Only a few soldiers remained stationed, while the rest of Perdium's remaining forces were spread thin, holding the castle walls in a desperate defense. Meanwhile, deep within the castle grounds, the mages dispatched from the Scarlet Flame Magic Tower were bound and encircling a magic circle drawn on the floor. Alfoy was furious, seething with rage as he demanded to be released, directing curses toward the knights guarding the mages. Alfoy's anger boiled over, and he shouted insults with each breath, declaring that they were mages, not soldiers, and they should never have been caught up in such a trivial estate war. Ferguson stood firm, attempting to calm him, urging him to stay composed since it was the young lord's order that they remain in their current position. Alfoy snapped back, incredulous that Ferguson could not see his frustration. He continued to rant, refusing to stay calm under the dire circumstances. Though visibly nervous, Vanessa stood her ground, faithfully following Ghislain's orders. The battle ram continued its relentless assault on the castle gate. In a voice full of despair, Alfoy pointed out that allowing the ram to reach this close to the gate meant Perdium's defeat was inevitable. He was convinced that the castle's fall was imminent. Despite her belief in Ghislain's plan, Vanessa struggled to calm Alfoy's spiraling anger. The reason they had been tied up was precisely because they would have bolted out of the castle the moment they got the chance. Irritated beyond measure, Alfoy glared at Vanessa, still seething. But as he observed her, he couldn't ignore the fact that she, once merely a maid at the tower, had now grown into a fifth circle mage. Though her face was pale with nervous sweat, her voice held an unwavering optimism, as she assured Alfoy that the young lord's plan would succeed and everything would be set right. Alfoy scoffed, brushing off her words. He told her not to make him laugh, his voice thick with scorn. He cursed Ghislain, screaming for Vanessa not to mention his name again. It was because of Ghislain that Alfoy had been dragged through hell and now found himself on the brink of death in the midst of a war. However, Vanessa was steadfast in her belief. She tried to plead with him, insisting that her trust in the young lord was unshakable. Furious, Alfoy commanded her to be silent. He questioned if she was truly willing to follow the orders of man he considered a lunatic. Vanessa's face hardened with resolve. In the most serious tone, she retorted that Ghislain, the young lord of Perdium, was no lunatic. To her, Ghislain was brilliant in mana control. He had been the one to help her achieve her dream of becoming a mage. A few days earlier, after a harrowing experience where her mana path had been unlocked with Ghislain's help, Vanessa had been on the brink of death. She had pushed through the excruciating pain, overcoming the obstacle, and had finally succeeded in becoming a full-fledged mage. Despite being a fifth circle mage, Vanessa's attempt at conjuring magic, using the mana cultivation methods Ghislain had taught her, produced only a flicker of mana. It was hardly the display of power she had hoped for, and she felt a deep sense of embarrassment before Ghislain. Although she had finally learned how to use magic, she apologized, explaining that this was all she could manage. However, Ghislain was unfazed. He understood that mastery over magic would not come instantly and reassured her that it was fine. He emphasized that simply being able to use magic was enough for now, and that her mana would grow over time. For the upcoming war, Ghislain had buried a massive amount of runestones outside the castle. In a move that seemed unthinkable to many, he had made the prideful mages dig the earth and bury these precious runestones, objects of immense value to them, in the dirt. They had been reduced to labors, something they could hardly accept. As the two approached the site, they found the mages panting heavily from their work. These mages, once held in high regard for their power and status, now found themselves toiling as mere laborers in Perdium. Though aware of the practical necessity of the action, Vanessa could not help but feel a pang of sadness as she witnessed the mages in such a state. But it was the sight of the runestones being buried that truly tore at her heart. Suddenly, Alfoy's voice cut through the moment, filled with disdain and contempt as he called out to Ghislain. Vanessa was startled by his sudden outburst, realizing with a jolt that the man who had tormented her was now in such a disheveled state. Alfoy's face was flushed with anger as he demanded to know why Ghislain had ordered the mages to dig. Why not use soldiers for such a task, he asked. If the runestones needed to be hidden, why not move them outside the territory entirely? Before Ghislain could respond, the man, the myth, the legend, Gordon approached and reprimanded Alfoy for speaking out of turn, prompting him to spit curses in frustration. Vanessa found the situation both absurd and unsettling. Turning to Ghislain, Vanessa nervously asked about the purpose of it all. Unfazed by the question, Ghislain explained that it was all preparation for war. He had foreseen the war, which was why he had not sold the runestones to the Scarlet Flame Magic Tower entirely, but instead had stored them for this very purpose. He went on to explain that in warfare, the simplest and most effective tactic was to overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers. He knew that no matter how hard the defenders of Perdium fought, the enemy would eventually break through the gates. However, that did not mean they were without hope. Turning to Vanessa, Ghislain told her that her role as a Fifth Circle mage would be crucial in their defense. With the runestones as a catalyst, and the mana of the other mages, she could unleash a devastating force that would wipe out large portions of the enemy's ranks. Vanessa understood what Ghislain was implying. She realized that this would mean taking many lives. She had always been grateful for Ghislain's help in realizing her dream of becoming a mage, but she had not yet developed the resolve to kill for the sake of the people of Perdium, people she barely knew. The weight of the realization hit her hard. She knew that if she refused to go through with it, there was a strong possibility that Ghislain would die in the war. The burden of his plan now rested on her shoulders, and she began to doubt whether she could really do it. When the time came, Vanessa activated the magic circle drawn on the ground, her resolve firming as she steeled herself for what was to come. With the estate on the brink of destruction, Vanessa, who had once unable to cast even a basic spell, was now performing the delicate and dangerous process of mana precision to absorb the mage's mana. The change in her was extraordinary. Alfoy's face contorted in disbelief as he realized what was happening. Vanessa had begun a mana transfer, a dangerous and complex spell that channeled the mana of multiple mages into one person. This spell had the potential to greatly amplify one's power, but it came at a tremendous risk. If the focal mage lost control, not only would all the participating mages lose their mana, but they could also lose their very life force. Without perfect control, immense mental resilience, and deep mastery over the spell, the risks were fatal. Yet, as Vanessa focused, Ghislain's words echoed in her mind, assuring her that he fully believed in her ability to succeed, and her eyes gleamed with brilliant blue light. As the mages were ensnared in the storm of mana, their energy being drained by the magic circle, Ghislain charged from the rear with his army of mercenaries. He placed his complete trust in Vanessa, confident that she could carry out her task to protect the estate. Meanwhile, the Perdium soldiers scrambled to block the gate with whatever they could find, stones, boxes, anything, while shooting arrows through the gaps in the gate. The situation seemed dire, but just then, Randolph called out to his brother, drawing his attention to the rear of the enemy lines. Zwalter immediately turned his head, momentarily abandoning the fight with the enemy infantry. A thick cloud of dust rose from behind the lines as a black cavalry unit charged straight toward the enemy ranks. Though the unit's numbers were only in the 300s, their momentum was unstoppable. Zwalter's eyes quickly identified the leader of the incoming unit. He had secretly hoped that Ghislain would take Elena and flee the estate. If Perdium were to fall, at least they could find shelter among the allied forces. But Ghislain was not one to abandon his estate, not after the despair he had experienced in his previous timeline. That was enough for a lifetime, and he would not turn his back on Perdium. The Black Cavalry unit moved forward with relentless momentum, and Ghislain led the charge. Their numbers were dwarfed by the enemies, but Ghislain did not hesitate. Common sense might have dictated that such a charge would be reckless, but Ghislain was not one to abandon his people. The weight of the despair from his previous life was something he could not carry again. Just then, Victor was startled as a soldier hurried to report the situation. Unknown to them, a cavalry unit had ambushed their rear from both sides. Under Kair's lead, one side of the ambush was taken, with Belinda providing support, allowing him to rampage through the enemy ranks. The mercenaries followed closely behind, wearing ponchos made from the Durust int bark, equally destructive in their charge. Meanwhile, Ghislain continued his lone charge toward the enemy's ranks. His eyes gleamed with a sharp, unyielding killing intent as he gathered his mana and released his mana cores. A perfect symphony of riding skill, swordsmanship, and mana control allowed Ghislain to tear through the battlefield. Each swing of his sword sent an enemy crashing to the ground. At first glance, he appeared to be fighting recklessly, but his movements were executed with such tactical precision that none of the enemies who charged at him could even graze his horse. Though Ghislain's current strength was far less than in his past life, the destruction he wreaked was still immense. Realizing that their rear was under attack, the bowmen panicked. Some even expressed disbelief that Perdium could possibly be receiving reinforcements. But then, Ghislain appeared, cutting through their ranks and heading straight for the bowmen. The bowmen attempted to halt Ghislain's charge, firing arrows at his horse in an attempt to stop him. But, in an unbelievable display of agility, Ghislain's horse leaped out of the arrow's path, avoiding them as if defying all expectations of what a lone cavalry unit could do. It was an absurd sight. Ghislain seemed to be flying with his horse. The bowmen could do nothing as their arrows missed, and Ghislain descended with devastating force. Every swing of his sword connected, tearing through flesh with ease. In moments, Ghislain had decimated an entire squad, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Even in his past life, this was how he fought, rampaging through the most dangerous places within the enemy's ranks. The infantry around him stopped in their tracks, stunned by the sight of a single cavalryman destroying so many soldiers so quickly. The fear in their eyes grew, and they began to believe that Ghislain was a monster. Taking a moment to catch his breath, Ghislain raised his sword high for his mercenaries to see. With their experience from the expedition in the Forest of Beasts, the mercenaries charged without hesitation, rallying behind their leader against the overwhelming enemy forces. Ghislain's voice rang out across the battlefield, carrying a message of defiance to both his mercenaries and Perdium soldiers. Despite their inferior numbers, he declared that from this moment on, they would begin their counterattack. Even though their numbers were greatly inferior, the Black Cavalry under Ghislain's leadership showed neither fear nor hesitation as they thundered toward one flank of the enemy's formation. Dygald Siege Tower had already been festered on the Perdium's walls, leaving no space for the defenders to breathe or regroup. Yet, despite the unrelenting advance of the invading infantry, not a single soul on the walls wavered. While Victor focused his efforts on seizing control of the main gate, Ghislain led a third of the mercenary forces in a flanking maneuver against the right side of the enemy formation. Simultaneously, Kair directed another detachment from a different direction, with Belinda providing key support. Meanwhile, Ghislain led the final group of mercenaries on a daring ambush mission, targeting the heart of Dygald's rear encampment. Ghislain's massive axe tore through enemy ranks with savage force. Each swing cleaved through multiple soldiers, leaving a trail of devastation. A handful of elite mercenaries followed close behind him, their movements sharp and disciplined, reinforcing his every step with lethal precision. As he pushed deeper into enemy lines, Ghislain barked orders to Gordon and Torrent. He intended to be the decoy, pulling the enemy's gaze and fury upon himself. He told the others to disperse widely and disable vital facilities to sow chaos. Without hesitation, the two acknowledged the command and moved to execute it. Even in the thick of combat, the mercenaries exchanged breathless words. Torrent noted how unnerved the enemy appeared, shocked by how few stood against them. Gordon echoed the sentiment, jesting that by the time they returned to the castle, all that would remain of the enemy camp would be scorched rubble. The situation rapidly unraveled for Tamos, the incompetent commander of Dygald's forces. Stunned by the surprise assault, He struggled to comprehend how such a counteroffensive had emerged from a cornered opponent. His mind blank, he failed to rally his soldiers, even as his aides urged him to abandon the camp and escape. That window of opportunity never arrived. Ghislain surged forward, cutting down soldiers in his path without mercy, his axe stained with the blood of those foolish enough to resist. He charged directly at the command center, declaring loudly his intent to capture Count Dygald alive as a prisoner of war. His axe pulsed with mana, glinting menacingly beneath the sunlight. Tamos knew in his gut that Ghislain could not be stopped. The man charging toward him was an unstoppable force, driven by pure will and fury. Yet at the last possible moment, a glimmer of salvation flashed before him. A sword strike, fast and precise, arced toward Ghislain. Instinctively, Ghislain turned, catching the blow with a powerful swing of his own. The clash of weapons echoed through the battlefield as Ghislain's mana-charged axe met the massive sword head-on. Sparks scattered with the force of the impact, the sound rising above the din of war. The two warriors pulled back slightly, locking eyes as they assessed one another. A knight of such caliber had not been seen in Dygald's camp until now. Morale had already been fragile with the presence of an elite warriors that can contend against Walter and Randolph at Dygald's front line. The sudden appearance of another high-level knight at their rear only deepened the despair. This knight clearly hadn't been drawn from Dygald's own ranks. Count Dygald lacked the merit to rally such strength, being a selfish noble unfit to rule, much less lead a disciplined army. From just a single exchange of blows, Ghislain realized the strength of his adversary. This was not an enemy to underestimate, not in the heart of hostile territory, where one wrong move could end everything. Seated tall upon his horse, the knight was Adon Freso. He observed Ghislain with a calm expression, commenting on the audacity of Perdium's forces to strike so deep into Dygald's camp with such a modest number. There was something almost admiring in his tone. Adon swung his sword again in a smooth, practiced motion. With a knight's honor, he asked his opponent to give his name in recognition of strength shared in combat. Ghislain remained silent. His gaze never wavered. His eyes, burning with an eerie and focused killing intent, studied Adon from head to toe as he readied himself for the next clash. Ghislain lifted his axe high, his entire frame pulsing with unrestrained mana. With a voice heavy with conviction, he declared himself nothing more than a nameless weapon in service to the young Lord of Perdium. His unwavering loyalty stemmed from a single, life-altering event that Ghislain had saved his daughter from the eternal punishment. From that day forward, Ghislain's devotion had been absolute. Meanwhile, chaos engulfed the left side of Perdium's castle wall. Enemy infantry swarmed like a mass of ants, climbing ladders in relentless waves. The defenders held the line only because they were no strangers to war. Hardened by long battles with the northern barbarians, they refused to yield. Belinda fought with grim determination, determined to provide the defenders with a sliver of relief. She knew that if left unchecked, the wall would soon fall to the enemy's hands. Spotting two enemy soldiers closing in, she lashed them together and hurled the bound pair toward Kair, who rode nearby and was carving through the flank. Kair accepted her help eagerly, his eyes flashing with excitement. As the bound enemies tumbled through the air, he stepped forward and brought his sword down in a single, fluid motion, slicing through both with brutal precision. Blood sprayed across the battlefield, a crimson arc against the sky. Caught in the exhilaration of battle, the insecurities that once haunted him faded, replaced by the unshakable spirit of a warrior. He surged forward, cutting through enemies with tireless energy. Despite the overwhelming numbers, some lightness remained among the chaos. Belinda called out to Kair, scolding him for splashing blood in her direction again. Kair laughed it off, referring to her dismissively as a mere lady and advising her to dodge if she had time to complain. Belinda flushed red with anger at the remark, clearly offended by the condescension. On the right wall, Ghislain led a third of the black cavalry unit from the front, rending through Dygald's flank with merciless efficiency. Each swing of his sword shattered the enemy's formation. Not even the heavy infantry could withstand a single blow. In the heart of battle, he revealed the essence of a warlord. The Mercenary King fought in the most perilous position, mastering the release of his second mana core with each breath to conserve stamina. The sight of Ghislain charging alone with monstrous force shattered the enemy's morale. Even with superior numbers, no one dared to meet him head-on. Once the mercenary army closed the gap and the opposition faltered in confusion, Ghislain issued a rallying cry. It was time to press forward and annihilate them. As the mercenaries broke through the enemy formation, Ghislain shifted his focus to the siege tower docked against the wall. He paused briefly, drawing a slow breath, and his eyes took on a glacial sharpness, a signal of the carnage to come. The mercenaries wasted no time. Their experience pioneering the forest of beasts had taught them that survival meant obeying their leader's every command. Not one hesitated, not one fled. They charged together, reckless yet unyielding. A captain from Dygald's army could do nothing but curse beneath his breath. Watching his men abandon formation in fear, he saw discipline dissolve in the face of Perdium's terrifying black cavalry unit. Ghislain galloped toward the wall once more, a line of the spearmen held up. Even with the sight of blood, followed Ghislain's path in his solitary charge. Despite being human, Ghislain fought atop his steed with a fluidity and unity that matched any elven rider. As the enemy blockade came into view, he gave his horse a simple order, to dodge the blockade alone, and the beast obeyed with a sharp exhale. The spearmen launched their attack, spears thrusting in perfect unison. For the first time in the battle, they managed to reach Ghislain, only because he had chosen to barrel through them, unwavering in his charge toward the siege tower. Then, without warning, Ghislain vanished from the saddle. He had leapt. The horse slipped through the formation with comical ease, untouched by the flurry of spear tips. While the spearmen were still turning their heads in confusion, trying to make sense of the vanished rider, Ghislain had already taken to the air. His sword was drawn high, poised to strike while the enemy below remained frozen in disarray. He came crashing down atop one of the spearmen, locking the man between his legs as he descended with punishing force. Using the spearmen as leverage, Ghislain twisted his body and swung his sword in a wide arc, cleaving through the ranks of those who dared to bar his path. His movements were fluid and unhesitating. There was no room for doubt, for he understood with ruthless clarity, and hesitation would bring swift encirclement from all sides. Once the opposing spearmen had been dispatched, Ghislain released the body he had used as a pivot, allowing the inertia of his spin to carry him into one final motion. With decisive precision, he brought his blade across the man's neck. Blood sprayed forth, sealing the act with finality. His sword now dripped with the blood of countless foes. None had been spared in his wake. The ground behind him lay desecrated, littered with limbs, broken bodies, and the carnage wrought by unrelenting force. No formation or resistance had managed to endure the overwhelming might unleashed by his fully activated second mana core. His eyes locked ahead. The siege tower loomed, tall and ominous, a grotesque structure feeding Dygald's heavy infantry onto the crumbling battlements. Below, a dense cluster of enemy soldiers formed a blockade between him and the towering structure. Yet, not a shred of hesitation clouded Ghislain's mind. A glint of sheer, razor-edged intent reflected in his eyes. No one standing there deserved mercy. Not a single soul among the enemy ranks would be spared. His verdict had already been rendered. Annihilation alone was acceptable. In one glance, he took in the situation. The wall's defense was in worse condition than he had anticipated. The collapse was imminent, likely to fail even before the gate could be breached. His black cavalry had pushed valiantly, breaking through where they could, but the disparity in numbers was severe. If they faltered even slightly, they would be enveloped. But surrendering momentum was not an option. Ghislain inhaled deeply, resolving himself once more. His eyes gleamed with renewed determination. He would keep pressing forward, no matter the cost. A corps captain from Dygald's forces issued an urgent command, rallying his soldiers to strike. The siege tower had reached its target. With the wall would soon fall, all that remained was to stop the black armored knight who stood in their way. The soldiers surged toward him. Ghislain raised his sword over his shoulder, steadying his breathing. For a brief instant, he tapped into the volatile energy of his third mana core, enhanced by the strange power obtained after absorbing the venom of the blood python. Though not yet equal to the legendary state of transcendence, the refinement of his mana gave his blade the sharpness needed to cut through iron as if it were cloth. His sword flashed. The first soldier to challenge him stood no chance. The weapon passed through his iron helmet with no resistance, the man collapsing without a sound, a mere offering to Ghislain's relentless advance. Another stepped forward to take his place. Armed with a crude sword and a wooden shield, the man roared a curse and lunged. But before his attack could even form, his neck had already been severed by a clean, efficient stroke. Still, more poured in. A heavily armored soldier jabbed forward with precision. Ghislain tilted his body and dodged with finesse, then countered with a savage slice into the man's side. Another enemy appeared immediately, blade raised and aimed for his head. Ghislain parried the strike, halting its momentum. Without slowing, he pushed forward. The explosive nature of his mana surged through his limbs, powering the motion as he spun and drove his blade across the attacker's back. Drawing closer to the siege tower, he came under a new threat. Arrows began raining down. The archers had taken position. Recognizing Ghislain's true target, the captain shouted furiously for every archer to focus their fire. The archer's captain ordered that the man was not to be allowed near the tower. But Ghislain was already past their sights. His body blurred into motion, streaking through the hail of arrows. None found their mark. Only the faint, gleaming trace of his killing intent remained in the space he left behind. Ghislain's next target stood above the fray. A corps captain mounted atop a trembling horse. The captain met Ghislain's gaze, his eyes wide with dread and throat tightening with fear. Whatever resolve had brought him to war now withered before the monstrous presence of the black-armored warrior. Without pause, Ghislain launched forward. His sword pierced cleanly into the captain's body before the man could lift his weapon. The captain offered no resistance. His fear had paralyzed him, and the terrifying aura of his attacker proved too overwhelming to confront. As though hoisting a carcass on a spit, Ghislain lifted the man's body into the air, twirled it with brutal elegance, and hurled both sword and corpse together toward the siege tower's thick central beam. The line of resistance that had dared block Ghislain's advance was now obliterated. The tower's archers, still fumbling to reload, bore witness to a horrific spectacle. One of their commanding officers slain and strung through the air like a display of vengeance. The sword embedded itself deep in the siege tower's wood. Blood spattered across the surrounding platform, painting the battlefield in fresh crimson. A stunned silence followed. Without delay, Ghislain tugged on a thread of mana, an ethereal link he had tied to the hilt of his sword. In one seamless motion, he leapt, drawn upward through the air by the arcane tether. The motion defied logic. None among the enemy could comprehend what was unfolding. All they saw was that the black-armored warrior had taken flight, soaring unrestrained toward the siege tower's highest platform. As Ghislain reached the top, his hand caught the hilt of the embedded sword. The blade, still soaked with blood, landed firmly in his grip. In that same instant, he swung. Terror surged through the defenders above, their minds filled with unspeakable dread, paralyzed as they recalled the massacres he had already wrought. Every line of defense that had previously tried to stop him now lay in ruin, replaced only by blood and severed limbs. Activating his third mana core once more, Ghislain allowed raw fury to flood his senses. His eyes flashed with cold judgment as he brought the sword down in an explosive arc. The entire top section of the tower split under the weight of the blow. No one could challenge him. Not here, not now. This siege tower, a key element of Victor's siege strategy and aligned perfectly with textbook military doctrine, was left almost undefended. The defenders had been stretched too thin along the walls, unable to secure every breach. Ghislain's timely assault now offered a vital reprieve to those still fighting on the ramparts. The shock spread rapidly through Dygald's ranks. The destruction of a siege tower by a lone knight in black armor had shaken even the most hardened soldiers. Yet some believed this act of defiance to be a foolish gamble. They reasoned that once the tower collapsed, its would-be invaders would swarm the lone attacker. Observing the collapse from afar, Victor remained outwardly calm. He pondered whether the warrior who destroyed the tower was the same black cavalry commander responsible for the devastating flank assault. As a plume of dust rose from the crumbling tower, Ghislain stepped away from the wreckage with steady resolve. The move he had made was bold, driven less by calculation and more by instinct. He had exploited the narrowest of weaknesses in Victor's formation. In the chaos of war, he had discerned the enemy's intent, gauged the battlefield's rhythm, and seized the fleeting moment. Victor turned to one of his soldiers and asked if the gate had finally been breached. The soldier faltered, stammering an explanation. The gate proved more fortified than they had initially assumed. Internal interference had delayed their progress, but he estimated success within 10 minutes. Victor remained silent for a breath. That delay could allow the black-armored warrior to rampage freely within their ranks. Deciding to act, Victor prepared to enter the battlefield himself. He walked forward, instructing his troops to break through the gate within 5 minutes. In the meantime, he would deal with the enemy commander personally. Before turning away, Victor shot a glare back at the soldier, his cold gaze heavy with killing intent. The message was unmistakable. Failure would be met with death at his own hand. Terror surged into the soldier's expression as he quickly confirmed the order with his trembling voice. At that very moment, a mounted mercenary emerged from the cloud of dust, hurling taunts at Victor and referring to him mockingly as a winged tin can. Cloaked in grit and ash, the rider announced that he would be going nowhere. Victor's gaze shifted slightly as he asked the newcomer's identity. The rider revealed himself as Kair, the commander of the Cerberus mercenary. His sword pointed directly at Victor in a bold challenge. A wide grin spread across his face, fueled by the thrill of confrontation. Having broken through the enemy's flank, Kair had reached the heart of Dygald's assault. Upon spotting the strongest opponent in their ranks, he could not resist the urge to call him angry. His sword pointed directly at Victor in a bold challenge. A wide grin spread across his face, fueled by the thrill of confrontation. Having broken through the enemy's flank, Kair had reached the heart of Dygald's assault. Upon spotting the strongest opponent in their ranks, he could not resist the urge to call him. With ferocious vigor, Kair charged forward on his horse. Despite knowing that Victor was stronger than him, there was no fear on Kair's face, only reckless excitement. His opponent remained calm and collected, observing the redhead charging at him with his sword poised for attack, seemingly unfazed by the mercenary's intense approach. Victor shifted his horse slightly, scoffing at Kair, who charged at him at full speed. As a high-level knight, Victor had mastered the art of fighting atop a horse. His movements were fluid, calculated, and precise. His horse responded to each of his commands with a seamless rhythm, making him appear untouchable. As Kair drew near, Victor's horse kicked Kair's. A mercenary driven by sheer instinct, Kair had missed his first attempt to land a blow as Victor rotated his horse after delivering the swift kick. Despite Kair's years of combat experience, the simple maneuver had thrown him off balance, but his instincts were sharp, and he quickly regained his footing. Victor immediately followed up with a sword strike aimed at Kair's neck. Kair noticed the sword coming. The speed of Victor's attack left no room for Kair to defend, and the mercenary realized just how outmatched he was in this duel. With no way to defend, Kair leapt from his horse, letting the sword strike sever the horse's neck. The steed collapsed, but Kair's focus remained entirely on his opponent. Though he had been outplayed fighting atop a horse, his resolve remained strong, and he refused to retreat. As he descended, Kair pulled his sword back and prepared to strike down with all his might. Meanwhile, Victor stood his ground, still atop his steed, ready to face whatever attack the redhead might throw his way with his unnerving focus. In quick succession, Kair delivered 2 sword strikes imbued with his mana, each more powerful than the last, toward his opponent. Victor easily parried both with practiced ease, his sword moving with minimal effort, as if the redhead's attacks were no more than a nuisance. But Kair wasn't finished. Gritting his teeth, he brought his sword down once more, this time with more powerful strike, carrying his momentum and mana. The attack was swift and filled with raw strength, but Victor raised his sword, prepared to block it casually. His demeanor was one of complete confidence, showing how little he regarded Kair as a worthy opponent. Kair cursed inwardly. He knew that fighting atop a horse made it harder for a knight to move, but despite his speed, his attacks were easily blocked by Victor. Kair's strikes had no effect, and his momentum faltered with every failed attempt. Victor deflected Kair's sword strike with ease, spinning his sword to dissipate the attack's momentum. Victor anticipated Kair's next move, reading the mercenary's body language and movements. He swiftly pulled back his sword, preparing for a counterattack. He had seen enough of Kair's kind to know what was coming. Pathetic mercenaries who thought they were strong, but they only swung their swords wildly, thinking that instinct alone could win them the battle. Now it was Victor's turn. With a smooth arc, he brought his sword down, swift and deadly, intending to finish the battle with a decisive blow. Before Kair could even land on his feet, he raised his sword in a desperate attempt to defend himself. He had been briefed on his opponent's strength, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming power of the high-level knight. The moment their swords collided, Kair felt the full weight of Victor's strength behind the strike. When their swords clashed, their mana collided as well. Kair's blade met Victor's, but it was no match for the sharpness and power of Victor's swordsmanship. The shock of the collision ran through Kair's arm, down to his whole body, as he still not yet regained his footing. Victor's mana-imbued sword cut clean through Kair's with uncanny sharpness. The impact left Kair reeling, his sword strikes losing momentum the moment they were blocked. It was clear to him now that he had no way of winning this fight. A sharp, searing pain surged through Kair's body as Victor's sword sliced through his shoulder. The redhead's ferocity, once fierce and unrelenting, was subdued by Victor's precision and surgical movements. His body trembled as he realized that he was no match for Victor. Still atop his horse, Victor looked down at Kair with mockery in his eyes. He couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority as he saw the redhead's resolve crumble. There was nothing easier to handle than a beast swinging wildly on instinct, and despite all his ferocity, Kair had proven no different from the others. Kair screeched on the ground after Victor struck and mocked him. Victor stood silently, appearing as if he were a noble knight, radiating confidence and composure, the very image of authority. Through labored breath, Kair cursed inside his mind. After the few exchanges of sword strikes earlier, he now fully realized how real Victor's strength was. It was exactly as Ghislain had explained to him before the charge on the flank. Ghislain had revealed that there was a high-level knight among Dygald's ranks, a knight named Victor, who was Desmond's hidden trump card. One among many, Desmond County stayed behind the shadows, targeting Perdium, had sent Victor to ensure their defeat. Kair had asked if Victor was stronger than the Perdium young lord. Ghislain had responded curtly, stating that Victor would be the strongest opponent Kair had ever faced, aside from Ghislain himself, who had once beaten him senseless in the Moriana recognition. Ghislain had elaborated that Victor was using Dygald's sheer numbers to force Perdium's focus onto defending the walls. Once their attention was diverted, Victor would break through the gates and launch a full assault. Ghislain had read the situation perfectly, preparing thoroughly by placing Vanessa at the castle to initiate their plan. However, Ghislain had also warned that if Victor entered the castle through the gate, the entire plan could fall apart. He had entrusted Kaer with the responsibility to hold Victor off until Vanessa was ready to unleash a secret concoction of destruction upon Dygald's forces. With a broken sword tightly clutched in his right hand, Kaer held his wound to prevent it from bleeding. He had accepted the responsibility to hold Victor off until the timid mage of Perdium estate was ready. Despite the hopeless battle they faced, Kaer had remained, fighting for Perdium. Even though Kaer was a mercenary fighting in a losing battle, his eyes glinted with lethal intent as he steeled himself, recalling Ghislain's words, urging him to hold the strongest knight in Dygald's ranks. Victor loomed above him, taller and more menacing now that Kaer had knelt, clutching his wound like a wounded beast being hunted. For a moment, Kaer felt as if nothing in the world seemed more dangerous than the man before him. Yet Kaer shifted his grip on his broken sword. Just as the blade gleamed with mana, a laugh escaped Kaer's lips. His expression lit up with excitement, defiance burning in his eyes. He hurled an insult toward Victor, telling him to at least be beatable. Despite his current predicament, he jested, trying to suppress the blood flowing from his wound, unwilling to let it slow him down. Meanwhile, the battle on the wall raged on. Dygald's forces seemed to remain unyielding, despite the Perdium young lord and his army of mercenaries joining the fray. At the rear of Dygald's camp, Ghislain was locked in battle with the mysterious second in command. Repeatedly, Ghislain swung his massive, bloodied, long-handled axe toward his opponent, yet he still failed to break through the knight's defense. His opponent, Adon, raised his shield to block every attack, swinging his sword only when an opportunity presented itself. Count Dygald, standing behind the battle, exclaimed Adon's name in praise, his admiration for the knight evident. One of his retainers quickly intervened, urging the Count to get back, warning him that he would be caught in the battle if he didn't move. Meanwhile, the mercenaries continued to tear through Dygald's support line. Much like Kaer and Ghislain, their loyalty to Ghislain had grown. They fought with seemingly unrestrained fury for Perdium, determined to hold their ground against the enemy's superior numbers. Trading blows with Adon, the sound of their weapons clashing rang out clearly across the battlefield. Ghislain cursed under his breath. Time was not on his side, yet despite his best efforts, he could not break through his opponent's defense. Adon seemed to effortlessly move his massive, heavy shield to block Ghislain's barrage of attacks. It was as though Adon was an impenetrable fortress, and Ghislain had not fought such a sturdy opponent in years. Yet he did not falter, though doubts lingered in his mind, questioning whether he was worthy to serve a noble-born young lord of Perdium, whose purpose was noble. Ghislain's loyalty remained absolute in the face of the young lord's enemies. With a wide swing of his axe, Ghislain landed another blow against Adon's shield. He screamed that he did not have time to waste on him, but Adon stood firm, his defense unbreakable. Calmly, Adon spoke, his voice filled with the assurance of one who believed the fight was already won. He said it was no use, that Ghislain's hit was solid, but that he would never get through his shield. Just then, Adon shifted his body to deflect the force of Ghislain's strike, causing Ghislain's momentum to lose traction and sending him stumbling forward. Meanwhile, Adon was already preparing his massive, long-handled sword behind his shield. Taking advantage of the opening, Adon thrust his sword. Fortunately, Ghislain was just as fast, pulling his body back and raising his left hand to block the incoming blade with his axe. Even after his sword failed to find its mark, Adon didn't stop. From his left side, he swung his sword in a wide arc. In its path was the neck of Ghislain's mount, which Adon severed cleanly with a single stroke. Fighting a high-level knight atop a horse was known to be difficult, but Adon's skill with both a massive shield and sword made him a perfect match for such battles. Ghislain cursed under his breath as he saw the inevitable outcome. Adon lifted his shield high, along with his horse. The sheer momentum of their combined weight would be devastating to Ghislain, who had fallen without proper footing. Yet Ghislain still raised his axe, attempting to defend. Adon's eyes glinted with a chilling, killing intent. He knew this would be the moment to break Ghislain's defense. He brought his shield down with crushing force. The collision was inevitable. The combined physical weight of Adon and his horse slammed into Ghislain, sending him crashing to the ground. The shock tore through his body, ripping apart his senses. But Ghislain held on. He knew that if he fell here, a tremendous danger would befall the Perdium estate, a place that sheltered his daughter Rachel, who had found comfort befriending Elena, the young lady of Perdium. Meanwhile, on the front lines, Kair was bloodied with wounds covering his body. Though his purpose differed from Ghislain's, Kair remained steadfast, faithful to the order from the Perdium young lord to hold the line. With minimal defense, the gate began to give way under the relentless force of the battering ram. With a final hit, the gate flew off its hinges, leaving it wide open for Dygald's soldiers to charge. Compared to the incoming forces that would soon swarm the castle, the Perdium defense seemed pathetic. A wave of terror washed over those inside. Zwalter, Randolph, and Scoven were already at their limit, defending the walls. No one had the strength to hold against the new line of attack that was sure to come. Victor turned his gaze and saw that the time had come for him to finish the war. Ghislain stood silently, having done everything he could. Kair was on the front lines holding off Victor, while Ghislain rampaged through Dygald's rear, spreading chaos. Lastly, Vanessa, the newly realized 5th Circle mage with a meager mana reserve comparable to that of a 1st Circle novice mage, was tasked with using her talent to destroy Dygald's forces with a massive explosion of power. Despite the seemingly impossible tasks at hand, Ghislain had placed his complete trust in these individuals. Inside the castle, Vanessa had absorbed the mana from the other mages who acted as mana reserves for her, concentrating her entire being on controlling the raging mana that wasn't her own. When the gate was breached, Alpoi, barely holding on to any energy, screamed toward Vanessa, urging her to act. He shouted, telling her that the gate had been breached and that she was draining their mana. She needed to do something already. A shimmering light glimmered in Vanessa's eyes as she responded, telling him that she only needed just a little more. There was no trace of doubt in her voice as she reassured him that she could do what was asked of her. Outside the gate, Victor raised his sword high, barking orders for all units to begin the full assault now that the gate had been opened. With a new breach in Perdium's defense, Dygald's heavy infantry were the first to surge forward, rushing toward the gate like a swarm of ants. Before departing, Victor called to one of his aides, instructing him to bring Count Dygald to the front line. He explained that he would deal with Perdium's commander. However, Victor did not yet know that Ghislain was the black-armored knight who had been running rampant within Dygald's ranks. He still believed that the knight was Zwalter. Meanwhile, breathing heavily from their previous clash, Kair stood defiant. His body was covered in blood, both fresh and still pouring from his wounds. He raised his broken sword, channeling every bit of mana he could muster into it. Frustration began to cloud his movements, making them more sloppy, but his gaze remained sharp like that of a beast. Victor asked if he was Kair, confirming his identity. He then continued, saying that at Kair's level, he should know where it was worth dying and where it wasn't. He questioned why Kair kept charging toward an opponent he couldn't defeat. Meanwhile, Adon, who was dealing with Ghislain in the rear, shared the same sentiment. He remarked that Perdium's gate had already been breached and that the side Ghislain had chosen had already lost. Victor spoke to Kair about the bold surprise attack Kair had launched. He acknowledged that while it had been unexpected, the outcome would remain the same because of the sheer difference in numbers. Speaking to Ghislain, Adon expressed that filling his elite strike team with worthless mercenaries was the mistake that doomed Perdium estate. He emphasized that their discipline couldn't compare to Dygald's. Victor added that a mercenary should know when to retreat if the odds turn against them. Adon echoed the sentiment, stating that no matter how skilled someone was, they could never defeat a well-trained soldier or knight. The two warriors shared similar words, each telling Kair and Ghislain that they had nothing worth dying for in this war. Standing firm, Kair chuckled, asking what it mattered if that were true. He declared that his life was his own, and none of them would have a say in it. Kaer and Ghislain had different purposes in this war. Kaer hated losing more than anyone else, while Ghislain was determined to lay down his life for his young lord. Their eyes gleamed with the lethal ferocity of beasts, both knowing that on the battlefield, there was only victory or defeat. Mercenary or knight, it didn't matter. Despite the great distance between them, Kaer and Ghislain charged toward their respective opponents. Each of their steps felt heavy, yet neither yielded to the pain that tore at their minds. Victor and Adon steadied themselves atop their horses, ready for anything that might come their way. Adon pulled back his sword, preparing to swing it wide. He spoke, his voice cold and unwavering, stating that a loser's excuses were not worth hearing. Adon's sword and Ghislain's massive long-handled axe collided once more. This time, however, Ghislain adjusted his angle ever so slightly, so that only their handles would meet, ducking low to avoid the sword's blade. With the remaining momentum from his axe's rotation, Ghislain used the force to pull Adon's sword toward the ground, making Adon lose his balance. Adon realized too late that Ghislain had used the inside of his axe to deflect the sword's momentum toward the ground. In that brief lapse, Ghislain quickly brought his axe upward, the sound of their weapons' handles screeching in the air. The massive axe swung in a wide arc, unrelenting in its force. Unfortunately, Adon had already abandoned his sword and raised a shield to defend himself. Still, Ghislain's strike severed the neck of Adon's horse. With a loud thud, Adon fell from his horse, his towering figure crashing to the ground. He cursed loudly, calling Ghislain a lowly mercenary, his voice filled with fury and disbelief. Adon had always been the one delivering violence, but never had he found himself on the receiving end. Now, Ghislain's figure loomed before him, the axe poised for a vertical swing. Ghislain's eyes gleamed with unrelenting fury. He was ready to break anything that dared to harm his young lord. Ghislain's axe collided with Adon's shield. Despite Adon's embarrassing state, his defense remained as solid as ever, testament to his status as a high-level knight. But Ghislain knew better. He spoke calmly, asserting that no matter how solid the defense was, there was always a gap. He pulled a sword from the sheath at his back and proclaimed that he had given his life as a weapon for Perdium's young lord. His sole existence was to bring him victory. Ghislain raised his sword high, pulling it back before thrusting it toward Adon, who had been unable to move after falling from his horse. Through the slit in Adon's helmet, Adon could see the unrelenting force that had driven Ghislain to attempt such a daring ambush in the midst of Dygald's camp, refusing to back down even in the face of a high-level knight. And through the same slit in Adon's helmet, Ghislain's sword found its mark. Blood sprayed as if Adon's head were a ripe tomato being burst with a sharp bite. Meanwhile, in front of the gate, Kaer charged toward Victor. Despite his battered state, he showed no hesitation in his movements. Inwardly, Kaer knew that Victor was far stronger than him, and he knew well that even attempting to stand against such an opponent might cost him his life. But Ghislain's order echoed clearly in his mind, for him to tie down Victor until Vanessa was ready. Even in the face of such a formidable opponent, the gleam in Kaer's eyes never faded. The reckless abandon in his bearing seemed never to cease. His mind focused on only one thing, to land a single strike on Victor. Meanwhile, in front of the gate, Kaer charged toward Victor. Despite his battered state, he showed no hesitation in his movements. Inwardly, Kaer knew that Victor was far stronger than him, and he knew well that even attempting to stand against such an opponent might cost him his life. But Ghislain's order echoed clearly in his mind, for him to tie down Victor until Vanessa was ready. Even in the face of such a formidable opponent, the gleam in Kaer's eyes never faded. The reckless abandon in his bearing seemed never to cease. His mind focused on only one thing, to land a single strike on Victor. A sudden flash of memory resurfaced in Kaer's mind, recalling the time he had asked Ghislain to demonstrate particular moves. Despite Kaer's usual antics, Ghislain had listened intently to the question. Although awkward and embarrassed about asking for instructions, Kair had inquired about how Ghislain managed to dodge a strike during their fight at Moriana's recognition. He was especially curious about one slick move where Ghislain had dodged and then quickly cut through the distance between them. Embarrassment showed clearly on Kair's face, but he still managed to express his points and ask Ghislain to teach him. Glancing back slightly, Ghislain smiled at Kair's growth in character. Before, Kair would have defiantly spoken toward Ghislain rather than humbly asking. Turning back away, Ghislain explained that the specific movements themselves were not what mattered. He said that the first time someone fights him, they'll probably think he is just a beast who charges straight in. Because of this, they tend to underestimate him. Now on the battlefield, Kair charged at Victor with Ghislain's word in mind. His body was bloodied, and his sword was broken, yet his spirit to land a hit never wavered. That determination drove him, an ambition to land a single strike against an opponent he could not defeat. Of course, Victor behaved exactly as Ghislain had explained. He swung his sword toward the incoming enemy, while muttering about how simple the redhead was, a beast who only knew how to charge straight in. Within moments, Kair reached Victor and launched a flurry of consecutive sword strikes. Unfortunately, Victor had seen every single one of Kair's sword swings, deflecting, blocking, and launching his own counterattack. Right after, as if pulling every bit of strength he could muster, Kair stepped back and spun. Using his hand like a bowstring, Kair hurled his sword. With mana lingering on the throne blade, it tore through the air, aiming for his opponent's neck. Victor simply scoffed, thinking it was only the last desperate attempt of what a wounded beast could muster. With an upward swing of his sword, Victor deflected the sword strike with ease. Yet again, Kair failed to land even a single hit on him. Kair had only accumulated wounds on his body, lost his sword, and now faced total defeat. Victor spoke condescendingly, saying fools always make rash decisions when they think they have nothing to lose, without realizing it will be their last choice in life. It was just how simple it appeared to Victor. He had not yet solidified his own realm to reach the superhuman level, failing to notice his opponent's intent. The moment Victor finished speaking, he spun his blade through his side. In a single motion, he swiftly thrust it forward, intending to deliver his final blow to end the fight with the redhead. Ghislain's voice rang out in Kair's mind, reminding him that if he could hide his true intent within his ferocity, and with it he could open a path for opportunity. The blade came straight for his head, but Kair showed not a shred of fear on his face. His eyes remained focused, facing what his opponent thought was the last blow. At the last possible moment, Kair shifted his head just enough, causing the sword strike to completely miss its mark by mere inches. Within that split second, Kair grabbed hold of Victor's hand to control his own movements. Only after the sword had passed did blood spray from Kair's temple, grazed lightly by the blade. Using Victor's own sword stance against him, Kair moved unnaturally fast to seize his broken sword still flying through the air. Being held off by Kair's sudden grip, Victor lost all momentum to pull back his sword, leaving no obstacle to Kair's swift, precise movements. At that instant, Kair brought his broken sword crashing down toward Victor. There was no time for Victor to maneuver his horse to dodge, and he knew it. That was the moment Victor realized Kair could definitely land at least one solid hit. The broken blade tore down toward Victor's chest. Without a chance to imbue mana into it, Kair's broken sword only grazed Victor's silver, pristine armor. Though Kair seemed to have no intention to strike Victor directly, he was aiming for something else, which was Victor's steed. The broken sword landed perfectly on the horse's spine, blood spraying vividly from strike. Victor had no chance to block the attack, since he trusted his sword completely. He could only watch in disbelief as the erratic movements of the redhead had claimed his horse. Quite literally, Kair had knocked Victor off his high horse as it fell lifelessly to the ground, leaving Victor no choice but to leap off. Meanwhile, Kair tumbled face first onto the earth in a comical, almost pitiful way. His breathing became labored and heavy. His body refused to move any further. After that brief but explosive strike he had launched, Kair's strength had finally given out. Victor thought briefly about that irregular move to catch a sword midair after he had deflected it. Even in a losing battle, Kair had laid the groundwork to turn the tide, a state only those prepared to die could reach. Victor did not immediately finish Kair off. Instead, he praised the redhead, admitting that he wasn't just a brainless beast after all. Kair's body still refused to stand. If Victor had wished, he could have ended Kair's life then and there. Somehow, Victor chose to entertain the wounded beast, Kair the redhead. Victor strode closer, raising his sword as he spoke calmly about how people sometimes surpass their limits on the edge of life and death. Unfortunately, Kair's strike had missed its mark. Throughout the fight, Kair's sword had broken, but remained clean of Victor's blood until he stabbed the horse. Meanwhile, Victor's sword was stained crimson with Kair's own blood. Pointing his sword, Victor asked the redhead, slumped on the ground and unable to move, if he had any last words. Kair muttered something under his breath, barely audible to his opponent. A flicker of surprise dawned on Victor's face, even beneath his iron helmet, as Kair clearly noticed that he had just flinched. The defiant smile on Kair's face never faded. He felt exhilarated as he loudly declared that he had finally landed a solid hit. It was true. If only Victor had not been wearing his heavy armor, the broken sword Kair had brought down could have embedded itself deeply into his chest. Just then, a series of throwing knives tore swiftly through the air, aimed straight toward Victor, who stood ready. Fortunately, Victor noticed them immediately as he lifted his head. It wasn't particularly threatening to him. Victor took a quick step back, skillfully dodging all the throwing knives. They landed right in front of Kair. Had they missed, they might have struck Kair's head instead. It was Belinda who appeared, swinging a hooked line as she maneuvered expertly above the two men on the ground. It was a rare sight, a woman clad in a maid uniform in the middle of a brutal war between two estates. Despite her fluttering clothes, her movements displayed the precision and discipline of a trained assassin. With uncanny accuracy, Belinda threw the hook, which landed squarely on Kair's clothes. She scoffed at Victor as she moved gracefully through the air. Given a chance, she would have faced the hidden blade of Desmond County without hesitation, but saving Kair was her immediate priority. Belinda landed firmly on her horse, darting swiftly away from the battle as she pulled Kair toward her. Trained in deadly assassin techniques and possessing mana cultivation skills that Ghislain deemed perfect, Kair's weight posed no challenge for her, leaving Victor alone on the field. All Victor could think about were Kair's last words. He pondered deeply how significant it was for the redhead to land a hit on him. Kair's last blow had stunned him, and if not for the woman's timely intervention, he might deliver the final blow. Kair was being carried away by Belinda atop the horse. He muttered that his enemy had almost died. Despite his inability to move, Kair still dared to utter such bold words, which prompted Belinda to threaten to put him down again if he didn't behave. On the other hand, realization dawned on Victor's mind. He knew that the single hit the redhead had landed on him wasn't worth trading his life for. On the surface, it wasn't. This was Victor's understanding, but he knew that for the redhead, it was something worth risking his life for. Victor turned his gaze around, trying to understand the overall state of the war beyond the immediate situation. Around him, the castle walls burned fiercely. Perdium's forces were swarmed by the sheer numbers that Dygald possessed. As things stood, nothing seemed certain to Victor. The fall of Perdium appeared inevitable. Turning his gaze toward the gate, he finally saw it. The redhead's valiant effort to land a single hit on him had been merely to buy time. Now, Dygald's forces were packed tightly in front of the gate. Only a squadron of heavy infantry could pass through at a time. Far beyond the line, centered perfectly from Victor's vantage point, a mana concentration gathered in the middle of the opening. He focused intently to discern what it was. A few tied up, passed-out mages circled a woman wearing an unassuming white robe. An old staff was held firmly in both of her hands. It was Vanessa. Her timid demeanor had vanished, replaced by a fierce and determined expression. She had yet to develop any longing for Perdium. The idea of killing thousands was far from her life's purpose. This was her own inner fight, one she was resolved to see through for the sake of her young lord. Victor's spine shuddered as the realization struck him like a crashing wave. A wild redhead had appeared solely to hold him off, buying precious time for whoever was inside the broken gate to prepare a devastating spell. Everything leading up to this moment had been a carefully laid trap for Dygald's forces. A gleam of brilliant light flickered in Vanessa's eyes as the voice of her young lord, Ghislain, echoed in her mind. He had told her that when the gate was breached and the enemy stood at the doorstep, she could turn the tide in an instant with her magic. She recalled the time when they had both overseen the burial of a massive number of runestones in front of the gate. She had asked Ghislain if she could truly bear such responsibility. Ghislain had turned toward her with unwavering confidence and assured her she could definitely accomplish it with her abilities. His trust in her was absolute, a pivotal wedge in the plan that, if it failed, would spell ruin for the entire estate. The same crushing weight of responsibility that Kaer bore to hold Victor off. Vanessa's lips moved softly, as if whispering a delicate incantation. With it came a tremendous explosion of mana, precise and exquisitely controlled by a single, once timid mage. She summoned a power far beyond human limits, defying the boundaries of the mage's circle. The immense mana swirled into glowing symbols orbiting Vanessa. In that suspended moment, every person present, ally and enemy alike, froze in place. In their eyes, the same vision unfolded. It began right at Vanessa's feet, the very place where the runestones had been buried. Between the lone mage and the advancing swarm of Dygald's forces, a crimson barrier rose, rippling like water reflecting the dying sun. Then, an overwhelming explosion of flame strike erupted. The unassuming, timid mage had unleashed the devastating spell Ghislain had concocted that only her talent could trigger. The sheer intensity of the flames engulfed every Dygald soldier daring to step within the gate's bounds. The earth trembled beneath the roaring inferno, the eruption of flame relentless and ever-growing. No one in Perdium's forces was harmed, as everything was perfectly aligned and timed for the spell to succeed. The shockwave pulsed outward first, crashing through the gate and spreading into Dygald's troops beyond. The blaze continued unabated. The runestones didn't trigger an instant combustion, but radiated power steadily after activation. The towering pillar of fire consumed siege towers and ladder carts alike, swelling larger with each passing second. As Walter stood silent, Randolph's jaw dropped in awe. Belinda steadied her steed, while Kaer summoned every ounce of strength to witness the towering flames. Gillian strode confidently toward the gate, drawing closer to observe the destruction firsthand. Ghislain gazed ahead with quiet contentment, as if awaiting this very day. Vanessa had surpassed all her limits, wielding a massive destructive spell possible only for an 8th circle mage, the cusp of human existence, a true transcendence. Dygald's forces fell into utter chaos. Those at the front could neither retreat nor advance to finish the war, despite the gate having been smashed open. Those further back fled frantically, unable to withstand the agony of being burned alive. The black cavalry unit commanded by Ghislain charged fiercely from the flank, striking straight at the broken formation of Dygald's forces. No one dared to stand and fight. The soldiers scattered, running frantically to retreat. Ghislain swung his sword relentlessly through the chaos, and the remaining Dygald forces offered no resistance. Those who survived the raging flames were swiftly cut down by Ghislain's black cavalry unit. Without pause, Ghislain barked out sharp commands to his mercenaries to encircle Dygald's forces. They were already in full retreat. The tide of the war had decisively shifted. Yet Ghislain showed no mercy, as if no one deserved any. From this moment onward, the only things daring enough to challenge Ghislain and come out unscathed were a cat and its owner. Dygald soldiers emerging from the engulfing flames had no moment to catch their breath before being met by the long, relentless line of black cavalry unit charging toward their necks. Every one of them had entered hoping to earn recognition for their service, only to now run desperately for their lives. Victor's breath came in ragged gasps. The oppressive heat was nearly unbearable. Fortunately for him, his bearing as a high-level knight allowed him to shield himself somewhat from the flames. Within moments, he understood that if they fell back immediately, his forces might manage to retreat through the battlefield's edges. Just then, a soldier approached him. With labored breaths, and unsteady steps. The man drew near to deliver urgent news. The soldier grimly reported that the situation was dire. Most of the troops had been burned alive. As soon as he finished, the soldier implored Victor to issue the order for a full retreat. Victor muttered under his breath in irritation. It was understandable. Nothing about this war seemed to go in his favor. His 6,000-strong army was being consumed by fire, leaving barely 1,000 able to retreat. On the other hand, though Perdium's forces were exhausted, they remained intact. From Desmond's perspective, this war had been meticulously planned over years of silent preparation. Victor had blocked every path to ensure Perdium's downfall. Yet one after another, unseen variables emerged to thwart his plans. There was Perdium's Black Cavalry unit, the formidable leader of the Cerberus mercenary Mad Dog. There was even a high-tier mage who had burned thousands with a single devastating spell. Victor let out a defeated sigh, realizing that these factors were perfectly aligned, not mere coincidence, to block his victory. It was as if he had walked blindly into a carefully laid trap. Supporting himself on his sword, Victor resolved on his next course of action. He strode off purposefully, ordering all soldiers to fall back and retreat for the time being. He explained that this area was not near the forest. Once they escaped the flames, they could regroup safely at the base. Victor expressed his deep frustration with the situation. He knew the conquest of Perdium would take far longer than he had planned, but given the current circumstances, it was unavoidable. With that, he ordered his soldiers to contact Adon immediately. Then he finally noticed someone approaching. Turning to see who it was, his eyes widened in disbelief, visible through the narrow slit of his helmet. Someone had come from Dygald's camp at the very rear of the formation, carrying Adon's severed head in hand. The gruesome sight of Adon's helmet, drenched in blood, added a further layer of devastation to Dygald's forces. It was Ghislain. He strode steadily toward Victor, his long-handled massive axe slumped over his shoulder, just as bloodied as the helmet that bore the fallen valiant knight's severed head. With steady resolve, Ghislain stood firmly before the high-level knight and calmly asked whether he was the commander of Dygald's army. Victor's breath caught in his throat, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on Adon's severed head. The fact that someone capable of slaying a knight as strong and loyal as Adon had appeared weighed heavily on him. Perdium's hidden forces, previously unreported and unknown, were deeply bewildering. Without hesitation, Ghislain released Adon's head, letting it drop to the ground with a final thud. Then he raised his massive axe and pointed it directly at Victor, issuing a cold challenge. His army and main camp were utterly destroyed, and he should surrender immediately. Whether this was another trap was unclear to Victor. The undeniable truth was that his forces continued to dwindle by the second. It was equally baffling how a mage could sustain such a massive, raging fire for so long, yet the barrier of flame still burned fiercely without faltering. For Victor, the war was over, at least in his role as commander. He let out a bitter, maniacal laugh, the sound echoing across the battlefield. In the next moment, he unleashed his mana outward, fully shielding himself from the scorching heat of the flames as he prepared to stand his ground on the battlefield as a true warrior. Ghislain remained unfazed, standing fearless and unyielding. The presence of a high-level knight before him held no tangible meaning for the old man who was prepared to die. Victor steadied his breathing and took his stance, proclaiming loudly that Ghislain should not make him laugh. Through his defiant words, Victor conveyed that the war might not end as expected. He declared with fierce conviction that he would slit the throats of all in Perdium himself and be done with it. With his breathing now steady and controlled, Victor proclaimed that his war was only just beginning. As a commander, it was his sacred duty to lead and command his forces. This was what was demanded of him to gain the experience required of a commanding officer. Now that his army was gone, only one choice remained: to stand alone as a lone knight in this brutal war. He was prepared to give everything he had, either to die at Perdium's hands or to push beyond his limits, manifesting his realm and transcending the boundaries of humanity to become a true transcendence. Victor proclaimed that his war was only just beginning. As a commander, it was his sacred duty to lead and command his forces. This was what was demanded of him to gain the experience required of a commanding officer. Now that his army was gone, only one choice remained: to stand alone as a lone knight in this brutal war. He was prepared to give everything he had, either to die at Perdium's hands or to push beyond his limits, manifesting his realm and transcending the boundaries of humanity to become a true transcendence. With Dygald's forces consumed in a wall of flames, Zwalter capitalized on the surge in Perdium's momentum. Amid the chaos, his voice cut through the air, commanding all units to fire their bolts at the fleeing enemy with no mercy. Protected beneath the reinforced inner hides of the Dirascent, the Black Cavalry units surged forward. They rampaged with brutal precision, cutting down any soldier who dared to raise a blade against Perdium. Their advance was unstoppable, fueled by righteous fury and armored resilience. From deep within the battlefield, Ghislain issued the same ruthless command. His voice echoed across the war-torn ground as he declared that not a single Dygald soldier was to be left breathing. His words carried the same lethal resolve that defined his charge. An awe-inspiring phenomenon unfolded as the battlefield was completely engulfed by flames. No one had ever seen such a spectacle. The inferno blocked any attempt at retreat or regrouping. Within its fiery boundaries, Dygald's forces were helpless. They crumbled before the unrelenting assault of the Black Cavalry, who moved with disciplined ferocity and full protection from the intense heat. As the battle raged, Belinda emerged from the haze of war, bringing Kair. His body barely held together. Kair laid as if lifelessly. She called out to her young lord as she approached. Ghislain halted his charge, both to steady his breath and to hear what Belinda had to report. To his surprise, there was no tactical update or urgent warning. Belinda was simply checking on him. Her concern centered entirely on whether Ghislain had been injured. He assured her with calm composure that not even a scratch had touched him. In turn, he inquired about their well-being. Being irreverent even in the thick of battle, Belinda found humor in the carnage. She directed a sarcastic glance at Kair, nudging him with her eyes to respond. Kair, drenched in blood and barely able to sit upright, he raised a trembling thumbs up. It was a modest gesture, signaling that he was still alive, though only just barely. Ghislain looked at him briefly and chuckled. The sharpness in his eyes remained, but his expression softened slightly. The ridiculous resilience of his subordinates brought him a momentary sense of peace. Belinda kept up her sarcastic tone, remarking that had their plan been delayed even a little, the outcome would have been a catastrophe. She remembered how crazy Ghislain's strategy had seemed when he first explained it. He responded with quiet assurance, simply glad that the plan had succeeded. She quickly added that she never wanted to do anything like that again. The expense had been astronomical. The cost of burning through such a vast stockpile of rune stones still weighed heavily on her conscience. Nevertheless, she conceded that the strategy had turned the tide of battle. With a half-hearted grin, she suggested Ghislain give some credit to Vanessa for devising the plan. Ghislain didn't dwell on it any longer, as he already planning to do so. Instead, his thoughts shifted. He asked about Gillian, curious why he had not returned. Gillian had been tasked with raising Dygald's main camp, and there had been no indication that he had failed. Logically, Ghislain assumed Gillian had found another target to engage after fulfilling his initial orders. Belinda looked alarmed. She had no answer, but ultimately reached the same conclusion. Ghislain didn't wait for confirmation. Trusting his instincts, he turned his steed sharply, lowered his helmet visor, and rode off toward the gate. Since Kair was with Belinda, and no one had eyes on Victor, it was clear who might still be out there. He left Kair in her care without hesitation. Meanwhile, at the gate, Victor charged like a man possessed. His eyes gleamed with lethal intent, unshakable in his resolve. He had vowed to cut down every last foe himself, and in Gillian, he had found a worthy adversary. As he closed in, Victor spun his sword in a broad arc. Still standing tall despite having slain Adon in the rear lines, Gillian braced himself. He raised his axe's long handle just in time to intercept the powerful swing. But Victor was not finished. His footwork turned into a graceful but deadly rotation. He spun again, momentum surging through his entire frame, and brought the sword crashing down once more. The follow-up was flawless. each movement flowing with practice speed. Ghislain had no time to retaliate. He could only raise his axe again, absorbing the devastating force that rattled through his limbs. Shock registered in Ghislain's eyes. Victor's strength was far greater than he initially expected. Every blow carried the weight of accumulated force, each one striking with increasing pressure. It wasn't merely strength, it was a lethal rhythm. Victor didn't pause. He unleashed a storm of attacks, forcing Ghislain into a retreat. Though both were seasoned warriors, Victor's precision was surgical. He moved like a weapon designed for facing swordmasters, forged through countless battles. By contrast, Ghislain stood his ground like a weathered lion. His strength came from years of surviving the harsh life of a mercenary. While his steps were slower, each stance radiated determination. His body endured, bruised and beaten, but his spirit remained unbroken, for now. Despite Victor's tactical prowess, the old lion refused to fall easily. In the midst of the clash, Ghislain managed a brief moment to rally. With renewed resolve, he unleashed a powerful counterattack, swinging his massive axe from behind as Victor charged into its range. The strike was aimed directly at the neck of the oncoming enemy. However, Victor reacted with inhuman reflexes. Launching himself into the air, he evaded the deadly swing completely. As he soared, his body spun in tandem with his sword, building momentum in perfect harmony between man and blade. Even before touching the ground, Victor had already positioned his blade for a decisive upward slash. His eyes burned with lethal intent, betraying no hesitation or fear. Upon landing, the swing came with deadly force. Battered but vigilant, Ghislain managed to twist his body just enough. The blade grazed his shoulder, sending blood splattering and knocking off the iron guard strapped to his arm. A pained hum escaped Ghislain's throat, a guttural sound of both agony and grit. Deep within, he assessed Victor's capabilities. His opponent, the Desmond County Hidden Sword, possessed absurd strength and speed, leaving no opportunities to exploit. Victor gave him no respite. Another charge followed immediately, forcing Ghislain into a defensive stance. At their level of mastery, a single misstep could result in instant death. The margin for error was non-existent. With unrelenting fury, Victor unleashed a barrage of strikes. His reputation as a field commander may have crumbled, but on the battlefield as a high-level knight, he proved unmatched. Each step forward from Victor pushed Ghislain 2 steps back, forcing the mercenary to brace and defend. Inwardly, Victor recognized the resistance. For a while, he had toyed with Ghislain, but the old lion's resilience began to irritate him. Furious that Ghislain had dared to push back so valiantly, Victor let loose a mental barrage of contempt, branding his foe a filthy mercenary rat. But Ghislain cared little for insults. He had already swung his axe with practiced determination. Their weapons met again, Victor's sword rising to deflect the crashing force of Ghislain's axe. He utilized the notch in the weapon to channel the energy and twist its path. With skilled precision, Victor hooked the axe with his blade, manipulating the leverage to his advantage. Ghislain instantly knew something was wrong. His grip weakened. The axe spun in the air, torn from his hands with stunning mastery. A loud crash echoed as the weapon landed far from reach. Behind them, the wall of fire still raged, casting violent shadows over their duel. Victor saw an opening and seized it. Now that Ghislain stood disarmed, he raised his blade once more for the final strike. Derision filled his thoughts as he prepared to kill a man he viewed as lowly and unworthy of facing him. Yet Ghislain's eyes remained sharp. He scanned every movement, calculating Victor's intent, searching for a thread of survival. Then came the thrust. Victor drove his sword straight into Ghislain's abdomen. Blood sprayed as the blade exited through his back. But Ghislain had not frozen. His vast combat experience had warned him just in time. Though unable to dodge completely, he twisted slightly, guiding the sword away from vital organs. The pain was intense, and a mouthful of blood erupted from his lips, but he lived. Victor noticed it as well. Ghislain's movement had blunted what should have been a fatal strike. Now, the mercenary clung to the embedded blade, gripping it with everything he had. For the first time, Victor reevaluated. He understood then that Ghislain's defeat of Adon had not been mere luck. Adon had been formidable, yet this man endured both that battle and the current one. It was reckless, perhaps even foolish, but it earned Victor's respect. In his final assessment, Victor acknowledged that Adon, of all people, would not have regretted falling to someone like Ghislain. With the decision made, Victor chose not to retract the blade, but to drive it deeper. He poured mana into the sword, intending to end the fight definitively. The command in his mind was absolute. He would make the old lion die here and now. But before the act could be completed, his instincts screamed in warning. Something was hurtling toward him with overwhelming force. A sword, imbued with a dense concentration of mana, tore through the air. Its trajectory was precise. It was aimed straight at Victor's head. Victor immediately abandoned his intention to finish off Ghislain. Instead, he gathered every ounce of physical strength, kicked Ghislain away from him, and propelled himself backward, tearing his sword free from Ghislain's desperate grip in the same motion. As his feet touched solid ground, Victor's head jerked toward the direction the sudden attack had come from. His thoughts raced. The very notion that someone within Perdium's ranks possessed the power of a high-level knight felt utterly impossible, completely outside any intelligence he had received. Measured and unwavering, Ghislain advanced across the battlefield, heading toward the two warriors locked in their fading duel. Ghislain now lay sprawled across the ground, drained of all strength, unable to mount any further resistance. Ghislain's arrival had, in that instant, spared the old mercenary from certain death. Victor drew in a sharp breath, shocked beyond words. He could not, for the life of him, identify the man who approached. This figure, commanding, armored, and confident, had never once appeared in the countless reports passed down from spies embedded within Perdium's forces. On the other hand, Ghislain exhaled in relief. Recognition settled over him as he saw the young master arrive to confront the hidden sword of Desmond County directly. As Ghislain closed the distance, he stooped to pick up the massive long-handled axe that once belonged to Ghislain. He twirled it playfully in his grasp, then let its weight rest naturally on his shoulder. Each step he took radiated authority. His breathing remained calm, his eyes unwavering. The wall of flames behind him roared, yet to him, the chaos felt like home. This was where he belonged, on the battlefield, where destruction reigned and resolve was tested. To those who had faced him, he was nothing short of a calamity. It was only then that Victor's realization hit. The black-armored figure before him was the same presence that had torn through Dygald's ranks with the black cavalry units. This was the unknown force, the devastating factor that had turned the tides of battle. With that understanding, Ghislain's third mana core surged to life. Power rippled through his body, flowing along a unique mana path refined through years of mastery. His eyes gleamed with lethal intent, a promise of retribution directed at the blade wielder who dared challenge Perdium's future. Ghislain moved. In the blink of an eye, or at least a blink to ordinary men, he covered the 30 paces that separated him from Victor. For martial masters like these two, time stretched, and every fraction of a moment held entire movements. The axe radiated a fierce, chilling edge as Ghislain charged, adding to its crimson hue, still stained with the blood of the foes Ghislain had slain. Rising into the air with a fluid leap, Ghislain pulled back the axe, drawing on momentum greater than what Ghislain had ever summoned with the same weapon. Satisfaction flickered in his expression. The regression had strengthened him. With it, he could deliver death to Perdium's enemies 2 times over. Victor responded instinctively, sword raised to meet the incoming strike. As their blades met, a thunderous explosion shattered the surrounding air. Though both used mana to shield themselves from the scorching wall of flames that hemmed them in, the raw force behind their weapons remained monstrous. Despite the impact, Victor held his ground. He understood now that he was facing Perdium's strongest protector. As the last real threat to Perdium, he knew the responsibility lay on him to end this. Yet, in the moment of collision, he also recognized that his opponent's strength matched his own. With a burst of force and the flawless application of mana reinforcement, Victor pushed back against the pressure, forcing Ghislain to flew back a few paces away. Without hesitation, both men resumed the clash. Their weapons moved in harmony, Ghislain's axe and Victor's sword, both primed for follow-up strikes. Blades collided again, ringing out in sharp clarity across the chaotic field. The duel was evenly matched. Ghislain's unpredictable, almost feral motion against Victor's composed, precise sword technique. They spun in tandem, each circling their weapons in arcs that carried significant weight and intent. Their blades met midair once more, sending another metallic crack echoing across the field. But this time, Ghislain pressed harder, letting the axe's weight and momentum flow naturally. He infused a fresh surge of mana into it, preparing for a more devastating blow to follow. Victor did not meet the blow head-on and instead resorted to evasive maneuvers, launching himself high into the air to dodge the oncoming strike. As he descended, he raised his sword overhead, aiming to channel the force of gravity into a crushing downward attack. Calm and unwavering, Ghislain required little effort to neutralize such a move. He simply raised the handle of his axe, bracing it like a reinforced pole. The oppressive heat radiating from the surrounding flames became background noise, insignificant compared to the metallic thunder of their weapons clashing once more. Despite the power behind Victor's blow, Ghislain held firm, unfazed by the strength of his formidable opponent. With the axe handle positioned like a staff, Victor's sword locked against Ghislain's right flank. Seizing the opportunity, Ghislain leapt sideways, leaving Victor no room to retrieve his blade. Then, using precise timing and athletic finesse, Ghislain drove his knee upward a hook around Victor's neck. The maneuver caught Victor off guard. As Ghislain rotated his body midair, Victor's head trapped between his legs. The momentum carried them into a spiraling descent. This unorthodox move left Victor helpless, unable to counter the unfamiliar technique. With a resounding crash, Ghislain slammed his opponent into the ground. Victor cried out in pain as the impact reverberated through his body. There was no escaping the blow. He had been forced to absorb it entirely. Gritting his teeth, he staggered upright, landing several paces from the black-armored knight, now gripping a blood-streaked axe. His mind raced with a question. Since when had someone of such power been hidden within Perdium's forces? He tried to analyze Ghislain's unpredictable movements, realizing any lapse in concentration could mean his death. Staying composed, Ghislain finally addressed him. He asserted that he knew exactly who Victor was. He spoke of the Dygald forces and their strategies, indicating a deeper awareness that extended even to Desmond County's secret hand in the military buildup. Having already made the decision to kill Victor, Ghislain saw no reason to hold back and elaborated further. He knew that Victor was Desmond County's hidden sword, and he also acknowledging the duchy's manipulation from the shadows. Now fully aware of the trap closing in around him, Victor's mind reeled. Could Perdium have uncovered such a classified operation? The possibility left him unsettled. Nevertheless, he tightened his grip on his sword and prepared to stand once more. Without hesitation, he charged Ghislain again, shouting out a defiant rejection of what he deemed nonsense. He believed there was no possible way Perdium had unearthed details of this top-secret mission. Their blades clashed again. As the skirmish resumed, Victor's thoughts swirled with disbelief. He was supposed to be a shadow, a covert weapon known to only a select few within Desmond County. His anonymity had been his greatest asset. Ghislain remained collected. He pulled his axe back behind him, rotated his stance, and delivered a crushing downward blow. Victor reacted swiftly, raising his sword and bracing himself for the attack. Their weapons met with another explosive burst of energy. Victor dismissed the idea that Ghislain truly knew his identity. He chalked the claim up to battlefield provocation, a psychological ploy meant to shake his focus. Refusing to waver, Victor renewed his concentration. The two continued their duel in close quarters, exchanging blows as equals. The blistering flames surrounding them became a forgotten backdrop. With sudden intensity, Victor unleashed a wide sword arc and roared that he would not be fooled by cheap tricks. At nearly the same instant, Ghislain launched himself into the air, bracing his axe like a pole to block the diagonal strike. Victor anticipated another unconventional assault. As Ghislain spun midair, he brought his axe down in a punishing arc fueled by momentum. Victor narrowly escaped the blow, stepping aside and pulling his sword back in one motion. Capitalizing on the opening, Victor brought his weapon down in a decisive swing. Yet Ghislain was resourceful as he pivoted around the axe's embedded handle, now lodged in the earth. Like a gymnast using a horizontal bar, he rotated his body and slipped just out of range. Using that rotational energy and putting mana into his leg, Ghislain unleashed a crushing kick aimed at Victor's head. The force of it sent Victor flying backward, another devastating exchange in a duel that refused to relent. The force of the kick left Victor's head ringing, the impact denting his helmet with a painful crunch. Ghislain, however, showed no signs of letting up. Using the remaining momentum, he swept the axe into position for another devastating strike. It was a direct embodiment of his brutal technique, a manifestation of controlled rage forged to bury his enemies beneath unrelenting power. Victor raised his sword just in time. The clash of steel rang out, deafening and fierce, as Ghislain's crushing power forced him down to one knee. Every fiber of Victor's being strained against the impact, and yet the pressure did not ease. Ghislain's assault continued with terrifying weight, as though the axe had a will of its own to crush and conquer. Victor's resistance collapsed, the weapon hammering downward until a burst of mana exploded outward. With a final blow, the axe struck directly atop Victor's helmet. The force was so great that the helmet tore free, blood splashing across the scorched ground. Still on one knee, Victor gasped for breath, his fingers clenched tightly around his sword. This war had already cost him dearly. Thousands of soldiers were lost to a force of only 1,000, and now in single combat, he was being overpowered by a knight whose name he didn't even know. Ahead, Ghislain walked with deliberate calm toward the sword he had thrown earlier to protect Ghislain. He moved as if unbothered by the smoke and flames. The black armor he wore gleamed with menace in stark contrast to Victor's silver plating, now marred by soot and blood. With a smooth motion, Ghislain picked up his greatsword and twirled it with ease, testing the balance. Though the long-handled axe had served its purpose, the greatsword felt more natural in his grip. Crimson light reflected off its blood-stained blade, and in that moment, he was no longer a knight. He was the executioner. Even Desmond County's hidden sword failed to challenge him. Victor's breath hitched as he asked aloud the identity of the Black Knight. Ghislain knew that Victor planned to retreat with whatever forces remained. Yet no such escape would be permitted. The plan already set in motion would see the Daigald's army annihilated to the last man. So he chose to indulge Victor's question. Removing his helmet, Ghislain cast it to the scorched ground. Beneath it was the face of a young man, handsome, youthful, and unblemished. Not a single mark of fatigue clung to him, not even the scent of blood. His sharp gaze pierced through the chaos as he revealed himself to be the young Lord of Perdium, the one whispered across the northern region as the scoundrel of the north.
So, friends, this chapter comes to an end. What will happen next? We'll uncover it in the next chapter. Don't forget to rate this chapter out of 10 in the comments. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care and goodbye. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.